I am Rebecca, 33 years old, and for 5 years I played the role of the grateful penniless orphan who married into the elite Kensington family. As a successful executive, I disguised my true identity to find genuine love, but instead, I found a den of vipers. On our 5th anniversary night, my father-in-law stood before 800 guests and called me the worst investment his family ever made. When I finally spoke back and exposed his failing empire, my husband slapped me across the face while the entire ballroom laughed. I simply wiped the blood from my mouth and made one phone call to the man they all feared most. Before I continue this story, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe if you have ever had to hide your true power until the perfect moment to strike back. The grand ballroom of the Kensington Hotel was a sea of glittering chandeliers, designer gowns, and the suffocating scent of old money. Tonight was supposed to be a celebration of my 5th wedding anniversary with Preston. For half a decade, I had endured the relentless whispers and blatant disrespect from his family. They believed I was a nobody, a low-level administrative assistant with no parents, no connections, and no wealth. Preston had proposed to me under the guise of wanting a simple woman who loved him for who he was, completely separate from his family's massive hospitality empire. I thought I had found a man who valued authenticity. I was terribly wrong. Preston stood beside me on the elevated stage, his hand gripping my waist entirely too tight. His smile was perfectly practiced for the cameras, but his eyes were cold and distant. In the front row sat his sister Abigail, draped in diamonds she bought using company funds, whispering venomous remarks to her husband Malcolm. Malcolm was an African-American financial prodigy and the chief financial officer of Kensington Hotels. Beneath his polished Tom Ford suits and calm demeanor, I knew he was secretly funneling millions out of the family business. I knew this because while the Kensingtons treated me like an ignorant charity case, I was actually the chief operating officer of Montgomery Capital, the most ruthless private equity firm on the East Coast. The clinking of crystal glasses brought my attention back to the center of the stage. My father-in-law, Richard Kensington, tapped his spoon against a champagne flute. The room of 800 elite investors, politicians, and socialites fell dead silent. Richard swayed slightly drunk on his own ego and expensive vintage wine. He grabbed the microphone, looking me up and down with an expression of pure disgust. "Thank you all for joining us tonight to celebrate 5 years of my son's marriage." Richard began, his voice echoing through the massive ballroom. "I have always taught Preston that in the hospitality business, every merger must bring value. Every acquisition must strengthen the portfolio. But I stand before you tonight to admit a harsh truth. Bringing a penniless orphan with absolutely no background into our bloodline was the worst investment the Kensingtons ever made." A collective gasp rippled through the crowd, quickly followed by scattered, mocking laughter. Abigail covered her mouth, giggling openly while Malcolm smirked, raising his glass in a mock toast. Preston did not defend me. He simply stared ahead, looking embarrassed that he was standing next to me. The humiliation was designed to break me, to put the poor orphan back in her place so Richard could assert his dominance over the room. But I did not cry. I did not shrink away. The 5 years of playing the meek, submissive wife evaporated instantly. I reached out and calmly took the microphone directly from Richard's hand. He blinked in shock, clearly not expecting the stray dog to bite back. "My dress might be off the rack, Richard," I said, my voice steady and amplified across the silent ballroom. "But your hotel's pension fund is currently down 40% for this quarter. Your occupancy rates are plummeting and you are secretly drowning in debt. Do not use my lack of parents to distract your investors from the fact that your empire is on the verge of total bankruptcy tonight." The color drained from Richard's face entirely. In the front row, Malcolm stiffened, his arrogant smirk vanishing as the exact financial deficit he had been hiding was suddenly broadcast to their most crucial investors. Whispers erupted across the ballroom like wildfire. Enraged by my defiance and terrified of the truth I had just spilled, Preston lunged forward. Before I could step back, he swung his hand and slapped me hard across the face. The sharp, violent crack of his palm striking my cheek echoed through the sound system. My head snapped to the side, and a sharp, metallic taste flooded my mouth. The crowd gasped again, and then sickeningly, some of Richard's loyal investors actually chuckled, treating my assault like a dramatic piece of evening entertainment. "Are you out of your mind?" Preston snarled, grabbing my arm and pulling me away from the microphone. "I only married you because I needed a compliant wife with no background. I needed someone desperate enough to sign an ironclad zero-payout prenuptial agreement without asking questions. You are nothing. Apologize to my father right now." I slowly turned my head to face him. I tasted the warm blood pooling in the corner of my mouth. I raised my hand and carefully wiped the red stain from my lip, looking at the man I had wasted 5 years of my life on. He was a coward, a pathetic heir clinging to a sinking ship. I reached into my cheap clutch and pulled out my cell phone. I dialed a number I had kept hidden from the Kensingtons since the day I met Preston. The line connected immediately. "Dad, please come." I spoke quietly into the receiver. Abigail burst into loud theatrical laughter from the front row. "Did she just call her dad?" she shrieked, pointing at me. "She is an orphan." The stress must have finally made the gold digger lose her mind. The entire ballroom erupted into cruel, echoing laughter. They thought I was a delusional, broken woman calling out to a ghost. But the laughter died instantly when the heavy oak doors at the back of the grand ballroom suddenly shattered open with a deafening crash. The heavy oak doors of the Plaza Ballroom did not just open. They were violently forced apart by a dozen armed private security contractors wearing tactical suits. The elite guests who had been laughing at my expense mere seconds ago froze in absolute terror. The string quartet stopped playing abruptly, causing a harsh, discordant screech of a violin bow. The sheer force of the entrance commanded the attention of every single person in the room. Walking through the center of the armed formation was my father, William Montgomery. He was a legendary cold-blooded Wall Street titan, a man whose mere signature could bankrupt entire nations. He wore a sharp charcoal suit, and his eyes were dark with a lethal, terrifying rage. The crowd parted for him like the Red Sea socialites and billionaires scrambling over each other to get out of his path. On the stage, Richard dropped his crystal champagne glass. It shattered against the polished hardwood floor, the sound ringing out in the dead silence. Richard knew exactly who this man was. For the past 6 months, Richard and Malcolm had been desperately begging Montgomery Capital for a financial bailout to save Kensington Hotels from going under. They had sent gifts, requested meetings, and groveled to William's assistance, never once securing a moment of his time. William ignored the terrified gasps of the investors and walked straight up the steps of the stage. He did not look at Richard. He did not look at Preston. He walked directly to me. His stern, hardened face softened for a fraction of a second as he reached out and gently touched my bruised cheek, his thumb brushing away the last trace of blood. "Which one of these dead men touched my daughter?" William demanded. His voice was not loud, but it carried a quiet, terrifying authority that vibrated through the floorboards. Preston stepped back, his hands shaking uncontrollably. His eyes darted between me and the legendary billionaire standing protectively in front of me. The realization hit Preston with the force of a freight train. The administrative assistant he thought he had manipulated, the penniless orphan he had abused. Rebecca, the nobody, was actually Rebecca Montgomery, the sole heir to the very empire he had been begging for financial salvation. "Mr. Montgomery," Richard stammered, stepping forward with his hands raised in a desperate gesture of surrender. "Sir, there has been a terrible misunderstanding. We had no idea. We did not know who she was. She lied to us. She committed fraud by hiding her identity. This marriage is completely invalid." William slowly turned his head to look at Richard. The absolute disgust in my father's eyes made the older man flinch. "You are complaining about a lack of transparency while your son assaults my only child in front of an audience," William said coldly. Richard swallowed hard, sweating profusely. "Please, sir, we can negotiate this. We can explain everything. My son was just defending our family's honor. She insulted our business." William did not engage with Richard's pathetic excuses. He raised his hand and gave a sharp, silent signal to the captain of his security detail. Instantly, the armed men moved to the exits, pulling the heavy oak doors shut. The loud click of the deadbolts locking echoed through the massive room. The 800 guests murmured in panic, realizing they were now trapped inside the ballroom. "Nobody leaves until I have dismantled every piece of pride this family holds," William announced. Preston's arrogant facade completely shattered. He realized that his life, his wealth, and his entire future were currently sitting in the palm of my hand. The false bravado he had displayed when he slapped me vanished entirely. In a desperate, humiliating pivot, Preston fell hard to his knees right there on the stage. He crawled forward and grabbed the hem of my dress, looking up at me with fake tears streaming down his face. "Rebecca, my love, please listen to me," Preston sobbed, putting on the performance of a lifetime. "I had to do it. I only slapped you to protect you. You do not understand how ruthless my father can be. If I had not stopped you from talking, he would have destroyed you. I was trying to save you. I love you, Rebecca. We have been married for 5 years. You know my heart. Please tell your father to stand down. We can be a real family now that the truth is out." I looked down at the man kneeling at my feet. The man who had spent 5 years treating me like a servant, hiding his affairs, and belittling my existence. He was begging for mercy simply because he had finally realized my net worth. The contrast between the violent abuser from 5 minutes ago and the sniveling coward before me was absolutely sickening. Abigail, still seated in the front row, finally found her voice. She stood up, her face pale, but her entitlement still intact. "You cannot do this," she yelled, pointing a shaking finger at me. "You cannot just lock us in here. Malcolm, do something. Call the police. Call our legal team. She is holding us hostage." Malcolm did not move to comfort his wife. The brilliant financial prodigy was completely frozen, staring at me with wide, terrified eyes. He understood the corporate landscape better than anyone in the room. He knew that Montgomery Capital did not just have money. We had unlimited power, political influence, and a legal team that could tie the Kensingtons in litigation for the next 100 years. Malcolm knew the game was entirely over before it even began. I reached down and grabbed Preston by his expensive silk lapels, forcing him to let go of my dress. I did not raise my voice, but my words were laced with pure venom. "You slapped me because you thought I was powerless," I said, stepping away from him. "You thought I was a vulnerable girl who would quietly absorb your abuse to keep a roof over her head. But you made one fatal miscalculation, Preston. You assumed you were the predator in this marriage." I turned my back on my kneeling husband and looked out at the terrified crowd, making eye contact with Richard, Abigail, and Malcolm. I had spent 5 years gathering their secrets, tracking their financial crimes, and documenting their abuse. The doors were locked, the trap was perfectly sprung, and the absolute destruction of the Kensington family was officially underway. Preston was still clutching the fabric of my gown. His tears stained the silk, leaving dark, pathetic patches on the material. I looked down at the man who had shared my bed for 5 years, feeling nothing but a profound, icy disgust. I jerked my leg back, tearing the fabric from his desperate grip. He stumbled forward, his hands slapping loudly against the polished floorboards. "Do not touch me, Preston," I commanded. My voice echoed through the silent ballroom, sharp and unyielding. The 800 guests watched with bated breath, entirely captivated by the collapse of the Kensington Golden Boy. The room smelled of expensive cologne, fear, and spilled champagne. Preston looked up, his face a mask of pathetic confusion. "Rebecca, please, I am your husband. We made vows. You promised to stand by me through better or worse. Vows you ensured were financially weaponized against me before I even walked down the aisle." I replied, my tone flat and devoid of any sympathy. I signaled to one of my father's security guards standing near the stage. The towering man stepped forward instantly and handed me a thick, leather-bound folder. I opened it and pulled out a familiar stack of heavy legal papers. It was the Kensington prenuptial agreement. I held the document up high for the entire room to see. The bright stage lights illuminated the bold black text and the signature I had been bullied into providing half a decade ago. "You made sure Rebecca the orphan walked away with absolutely nothing," I said, letting the pages slip from my fingers. They fluttered down like dead leaves, landing directly on Preston's trembling hands and scattering across his expensive tuxedo. You drafted a document so ironclad, so deeply predatory, that if I ever tried to leave your toxic family, I would be left on the street without a single dime. You and your father spent weeks laughing about how easily you trapped me. Preston stared at the pages covering the floor, his mouth opening and closing wordlessly. He looked like a fish suffocating on dry land. He knew exactly what was written on those pages. But you forgot one crucial detail. I continued pacing slowly around his kneeling form, making sure my voice reached every corner of the vast room. You insisted on an infidelity penalty clause to protect the Kensington brand from public scandal. You demanded that if either party committed adultery, they would forfeit an immediate cash penalty to the injured spouse. You signed it willingly. You agreed to a $100 million fine because you thought I was too poor, too uneducated, and too isolated to ever afford a lawyer to enforce it. From the front row, a sharp, indignant shriek shattered the tension. Abigail pushed past my father's security detail, her designer heels clicking aggressively against the hardwood floor. Her face was flushed dark red with anger. She had always hated me. For 5 years, she had treated me like the hired help at every Thanksgiving dinner, loudly criticizing my clothes and my lack of pedigree. Now seeing her beloved brother humiliated was tearing her fragile ego apart. "You are bluffing, you lying gold digger," Abigail screamed, pointing a manicured finger an inch from my face. Her diamond bracelets rattled violently with the gesture. "Preston has never been unfaithful. He is a Kensington. He has breeding and loyalty. You are just a manipulative snake trying to extort my family because your own father is a thug. You have absolutely no proof of infidelity. None." I met Abigail's furious gaze without blinking. I did not raise my voice, letting the absolute calm of my demeanor highlight her unhinged hysteria. "Are you entirely sure you want to defend him right now, Abigail? Because standing in the blast radius of this explosion is going to ruin your very expensive dress." "Shut up," she hissed, her eyes wild with rage. She turned to her husband, who was still standing paralyzed near the front tables. "Malcolm, do something. You are the chief financial officer of this company. Destroy her. Use your power. Freeze everything she has. Make her pay for insulting us." Malcolm hesitated. As an African-American financial prodigy who had married into the Kensington wealth, he usually played his cards incredibly close to the vest. He was the brains behind their entire operation, the man who kept Richard's failing empire afloat through aggressive accounting. He stepped forward slowly, adjusting his bespoke Tom Ford tie. He threw his shoulders back, trying to project the intimidating, untouchable corporate aura he used to crush rivals in boardrooms. "Listen to me very carefully, Rebecca." Malcolm set his voice, a low, threatening rumble designed to intimidate. "I do not care who your father is or how many men he brought with him tonight. I know the legal loopholes in your marriage contract inside and out. As the CFO of the Kensington Trust, I oversee all joint accounts. I can initiate a marital asset freeze right now from my phone." He pulled his smartphone from his pocket, holding it up like a loaded weapon. He tapped the screen, bringing up his banking application. "I will lock down your credit cards, your banking access, and every single dime tied to the Kensington name," Malcolm threatened, taking another step toward the stage. "You will not have the capital to hire a paralegal, let alone litigate a billionaire penalty clause. You will be entirely cut off from the world." He glared at me, confident that he had backed me into a corner. "Drop this entire act, apologize to Richard for your outburst, and walk out of here quietly, or I press one button and completely paralyze your life." I did not flinch. I did not break eye contact with the CFO. Instead, I smiled. It was a slow, predatory smile that made Malcolm pause, a flicker of doubt finally crossing his composed features. I reached into the hidden pocket of my clutch and withdrew a sleek black USB drive. I walked over to the nearest dining table, clearing away a massive crystal centerpiece with a swift, careless motion of my hand. The glass shattered on the floor, but nobody moved. I set the black USB drive on the white tablecloth. With one perfectly manicured finger, I slid it smoothly across the table until it stopped right in front of Malcolm. "Before you freeze my checking account, Malcolm," I said, my voice dropping to a lethal whisper that carried across the dead silent room. "Let us talk about the $15 million you routed through shell companies in the Cayman Islands last quarter." Malcolm stared at the black flash drive resting against the pristine white linen of the dining table. For a fraction of a second, the mask of the untouchable corporate prodigy slipped, revealing the terrified fraud underneath. He blinked rapidly, adjusting his cuffs in a frantic, self-soothing gesture. But he recovered quickly, relying on the arrogant playbook that had kept him in power at Kensington Hotels for years. "You are making wild, slanderous accusations to deflect from your own fraudulent marriage." Malcolm sneered deliberately, raising his voice so the surrounding investors could hear him. He stepped closer to the table, projecting a sickening aura of mock pity. "As chief financial officer, I execute thousands of complex mezzanine financing structures, collateralized debt obligations, and offshore tax deferral vehicles every single fiscal quarter. You are a low-level administrative assistant who barely understands how to balance a petty cash drawer. You saw a standard corporate restructuring transfer to our Caribbean subsidiaries and let your uneducated imagination run wild." I did not let him finish his patronizing corporate word salad. I stood up straight, smoothing the skirt of my dress, and looked him dead in the eye. "You created 3 dummy corporations registered under your mother's maiden name in the Cayman Islands." I stated clearly, my voice slicing through his financial jargon like a scalpel. "You initiated 27 separate wire transfers over the last 9 months, burying the transactions under the guise of the hotel's upcoming architectural renovation budget. You authorized fake invoices from phantom construction firms. You approved the payouts yourself. You even used the exact same IP address from your corner executive office to access the offshore accounts. Every single wire transfer receipt, IP log, and forged invoice is sitting on that drive, Malcolm." The color drained completely from Malcolm's face. The smooth, confident executive vanished entirely, replaced by a man who suddenly realized he was staring down the barrel of a 20-year federal prison sentence. He reached out toward the USB drive, his hand trembling so violently that his heavy gold watch rattled against his wrist. Abigail, who had been standing a few feet away, shoved past her brother Preston and marched right up to her husband. Her face was twisted in a mixture of confusion and building rage. She grabbed his arm, pulling his attention away from the table. "Malcolm, what is she talking about?" Abigail demanded, her voice shrill and demanding, echoing horribly in the quiet ballroom. "Tell me this pathetic orphan is lying. Tell me you did not steal $15 million from my family." Malcolm could not look at his wife. He kept his eyes glued to the black plastic drive on the table, paralyzed by the sheer weight of the evidence against him. The silence stretching between them was louder than any confession could ever be. Abigail grabbed his shoulder with both hands and yanked him around to face her. "Answer me!" she shrieked, her perfectly manicured nails digging into the expensive fabric of his suit jacket. "I just spent $4 million renovating our penthouse. I bought the yacht in Miami. If you stole that money from the hotel's renovation fund, my father will literally kill you. Tell me she is making this up right now." But Malcolm just stood there, breathing heavily, sweat beading on his forehead. A low, guttural groan echoed from the stage. Richard Kensington gripped the edge of the podium. His face shifted into a dangerous shade of purple. The alcohol and arrogance that had fueled his earlier speech were completely gone, replaced by the crushing realization of his own financial ruin. The pension fund. Richard gasped, his voice barely a whisper, as he stared down at his son-in-law. "You told me the market took a downturn. You told me our capital was tied up in aggressive expansion portfolios. We have been begging Montgomery Capital for a bailout for 6 months because we could not even make payroll. You bankrupted my entire legacy so you could buy yachts and penthouses." "I did it for your daughter," Malcolm snapped, finally breaking under the immense pressure. He shoved Abigail away from him, his voice cracking with panic and deep-seated resentment. "She spends money faster than we can print it. She demanded the lifestyle of a billionaire Richard. Your hotel chain is a dinosaur. The profit margins are dead. I was the only one keeping the creditors away with creative accounting. You stole from me! Richard roared, stumbling down the steps of the stage. He looked like he wanted to wrap his hands around Malcolm's throat. You arrogant thief! I gave you everything. I made you chief financial officer. The beautiful elite Kensington family unity shattered into a million irreparable pieces right in front of 800 of their most important investors. It was a spectacular implosion. Abigail began screaming hysterically, slapping her hands against Malcolm's chest, cursing him for ruining her social standing. Richard was gasping for air, clutching his chest as the reality of his financial ruin set in. Preston was still kneeling on the floor, completely forgotten and irrelevant, watching his family tear each other apart. The investors in the room were no longer laughing. They were pulling out their phones, frantically texting their brokers to dump any stock associated with the Kensington name. The precious Kensington empire was burning, and I had simply handed them the match. Malcolm shoved Abigail backward with enough force that she tripped over her own designer heels and fell hard against a dining chair. He was like a cornered animal operating on pure survival instinct. He reached into his pocket and pulled out his smartphone, his thumbs moving frantically across the screen. He looked up at me, his eyes wide and completely unhinged. You think you have won, because you have a little flash drive, Malcolm sneered, panting heavily. You think you can just march in here and destroy my life. He held the phone up his thumb, hovering deliberately over the center of the screen. As the chief financial officer, I have master administrative access to every single server in the Kensington Hotel network. Malcolm said, his voice rising in desperate defiance. I have a remote wipe protocol designed for extreme security breaches. It will instantly trigger a total corporate blackout. It will permanently delete every financial record, every guest log, every payroll file, and every internal email stored in this company's history. The Kensingtons will not be able to prove a single transaction, and you will not be able to prove I stole a dime. He took a deliberate step toward the dining table, his eyes locked intensely on the black USB drive. Hand over the drive, Rebecca, Malcolm demanded, his voice shaking with frantic energy. Kick it across the table to me right now, or I press this button and burn the entire digital infrastructure of this company to the ground. You have 5 seconds before I wipe the servers. Malcolm stopped breathing. The hand he had raised to retrieve his smartphone froze completely in midair. The arrogant sneer melted off his face, replaced by the pale, clammy sheen of absolute terror. He stared at the black flash drive resting on the white linen as if it were a live grenade. He stared at the end of his career. He stared at his own destruction. Abigail whipped her head toward her husband. The heavy diamond earrings she wore clattered loudly in the dead silence of the ballroom. Malcolm, she shrieked, her voice cracking with rising panic. What is she talking about? Tell me she is lying. Tell me you did not steal. Tell me my perfect life is not over. Malcolm did not answer. He could not. His eyes were locked on the drive, his mind frantically calculating how I could possibly have bypassed his encrypted corporate firewalls. Tell me you did not steal $15 million from my family, Abigail screamed. She grabbed the lapels of his custom suit and shook him violently. I just spent $4 million renovating the Miami yacht. If you stole that money from the hotel's operating budget, my father will literally destroy us. On the stage, Richard Kensington staggered backward, clutching the wooden podium for support. The alcohol had completely worn off, leaving behind a terrified old man, watching his legacy evaporate in real time. The pension funds. Richard gasped, pointing a trembling finger at his son-in-law. You told me the market took a downturn. We have been begging Montgomery Capital for a bailout for 6 months because we could not even make payroll. You bankrupted my entire empire to fund your lifestyle. I did it for your daughter, Malcolm roared, finally snapping under the immense pressure. He shoved Abigail away from him with such force she stumbled. She spends money faster than we can print it. Your hotel chain is a dinosaur, Richard. I was the only one keeping the creditors away with creative accounting. I kept this family alive. I kept you relevant. I kept you from sinking. The pristine, elite Kensington family unity shattered into a million irreparable pieces right in front of 800 of their most important investors. The wealthy guests were no longer laughing. They were pulling out their phones, frantically texting their brokers to dump Kensington stock before the market opened on Monday morning. Realizing his life was entirely over, Malcolm went feral. He ripped his smartphone from his pocket, his thumbs moving frantically across the screen. "You think a little flash drive gives you the win, Rebecca?" he panted, his eyes wide and completely unhinged. "As Chief Financial Officer, I have master administrative access to every single server in the Kensington network. I have a remote wipe protocol. I will trigger a total corporate blackout right now. It will permanently delete every financial record. It will delete every guest log. It will delete every internal email in this company's history. You will not be able to prove I stole a dime." He hovered his thumb over the glowing screen. "Hand over the drive or I burn the digital infrastructure to the ground." Before Malcolm's thumb could even graze the glass, a massive hand clamped down on his wrist. One of my father's tactical security contractors had moved with terrifying silent speed. The guard twisted Malcolm's arm sharply behind his back, forcing a loud cry of pain from the executive, and snatched the phone away. The guard stepped back and respectfully handed the device to my father. William Montgomery stood like a monolith of impending doom, unimpressed by the frantic scramble of desperate thieves. He barely glanced at the phone before slipping it into his tailored suit pocket. "Server wipes are so terribly outdated," my father said coldly. "My tech division cloned your entire mainframe 3 hours ago." Malcolm collapsed to his knees, utterly defeated. Abigail, watching her husband's destruction and realizing her lavish lifestyle was officially dead, turned her hysterical rage entirely on me. She could not accept the humiliation. She needed a scapegoat. She needed to drag me down into the mud with her. "You think you are so brilliant!" Abigail screamed, her face contorted with pure spite. "You think you can just destroy my family and walk away the victor? You are still a pathetic failure of a wife. You could not even keep your own husband in your bed." She turned to the crowd of trapped guests and frantically waved her hand. "Kendra, get up here right now. Show this arrogant witch the truth." From the third row of dining tables, a stunningly beautiful woman in a skin-tight red dress stood up. She had long, perfectly styled blonde hair and carried herself with absolute triumph. It was Kendra Preston's executive assistant. I had known about her for 3 years. 5 years of biting my tongue. 5 years of swallowing their insults. 5 years of playing the fool while I watched her leave her perfume on his collars. Kendra strutted toward the stage, savoring the attention of the entire ballroom. She walked right past Preston, who was still kneeling on the floor, and stopped a few feet away from me. She placed a possessive, dramatic hand over her slightly rounded stomach. "Preston has been sharing my bed since your first anniversary," Kendra announced proudly, her voice echoing clearly across the room. "You are just a placeholder, Rebecca. A placeholder for his public image. A placeholder for his family's approval. A placeholder until I came along. I am carrying the true Kensington heir. I am pregnant with Preston's baby." The ballroom erupted into chaotic whispers. Abigail smiled viciously, thinking she had delivered the ultimate killing blow to my pride. But Preston was not smiling. The blood drained completely from his face, leaving him looking like a corpse. He scrambled to his feet, lunging toward Kendra with pure panic in his eyes. "Shut your mouth, Kendra!" Preston screamed, grabbing her arms so hard she winced. "Do not say another word." He turned to me, trembling violently. He finally remembered the first secret weapon I had dropped on the floor. The prenuptial agreement. The $100 million infidelity penalty clause. By bringing Kendra out and having her publicly announce the affair and the pregnancy, Abigail had just provided 800 wealthy witnesses to Preston's breach of contract. "Rebecca, she is lying!" Preston begged, his voice cracking hysterically. "She is a delusional stalker. I never touched her. I swear to you. I swear to you." I looked at Kendra, whose triumphant smile was quickly turning into confusion as her lover violently denied their relationship. Then I looked at Preston. He had lied to me. He had lied to his family. He had lied to his mistress. I calmly reached into my clutch one final time and pulled out a small remote control. I pointed it at the audiovisual booth at the back of the room. Instantly, the massive projector screen behind the stage, which had been displaying a slideshow of our wedding photos, went entirely black. A second later, a highly classified, heavily redacted medical file illuminated the entire ballroom. The stark white background cast a harsh, unforgiving glow over the stage. The text was massive, undeniable, and stamped with the logo of the top fertility clinic in the state. "You are absolutely right, Preston," I said, my voice echoing with absolute finality. "Kendra is a liar." I turned to face the mistress, who was now staring at the massive screen in absolute horror. "You see, Kendra? You should have done your research before trying to secure a bag with a married man," I said, reading the medical file aloud for the entire room. 5 years ago, Preston contracted a severe infection while vacationing in Thailand. He had an emergency surgical procedure to save his life. I stepped closer to her, lowering my voice, so only the front rows and the microphones caught the deadly truth. The surgery left him completely and irreversibly sterile. My husband cannot have children. He never could. He never would. So whoever fathered the child you are carrying it is definitely not Preston Kensington. The silence that followed my announcement was absolute. Kendra dropped her hand from her stomach as if the child she carried had suddenly turned to lead. She stared at Preston, her eyes wide with a frantic, searching panic, waiting for him to deny the medical file glaring on the massive screen behind us. But Preston could not speak. He was completely paralyzed, his jaw slack, his face an ashen mask of pure humiliation. The truth was undeniable, broadcast in high definition for every major investor and socialite in the city to witness. A collective murmur of revulsion swept through the ballroom. The elite guests, who just an hour ago had been laughing at Richard's cruel jokes at my expense, were now staring at the Kensington men with undisguised contempt. My father, William Montgomery, gave a sharp nod to his security captain. The heavy deadbolts on the oak doors clicked open in perfect unison. There was no chaotic stampede. Instead, the 800 guests turned their backs on the Kensington family and walked out in a suffocating, judgmental silence. They were abandoning a sinking ship. I turned my back on Preston, took my father's arm, and walked out into the cool night air, leaving my abusers standing in the ruins of their shattered empire. The next morning, the air inside my executive office at Montgomery Capital smelled of fresh espresso and absolute victory. I sat behind my massive mahogany desk on the 42nd floor, looking out through the floor-to-ceiling windows at the sprawling Manhattan skyline. I had shed the cheap, off-the-rack dresses I wore to placate my husband's ego. Today, I wore a tailored midnight blue suit, my hair pulled back into a sharp, unyielding style. I was no longer the submissive wife. I was the chief operating officer of a multi-billion-dollar private equity firm, and I was exactly where I belonged. My morning review of Kensington Hotel's plummeting stock prices was violently interrupted. The heavy glass doors to my executive suite flew open, slamming against the magnetic stops. Richard and Preston stormed into the room, flanked by two aggressive, red-faced corporate lawyers. My security detail moved to intercept them instantly, grabbing Preston by the shoulders, but I raised my hand. I signaled for the guards to step back. I wanted to see exactly how desperate these men had become. Richard marched directly to my desk, his face flushed with a toxic mixture of rage and severe sleep deprivation. He slammed both of his hands down on the polished wood. Preston stood just behind him, attempting to project confidence, but the dark circles under his eyes betrayed his terror. "You think you have destroyed us?" Richard snarled, his voice hoarse from yelling. "You think you can humiliate my family, ruin my stock prices, and just walk away to your little ivory tower? We are Kensingtons. We do not lose to manipulative little girls." I leaned back in my leather chair, steepling my fingers. "You have already lost, Richard. The market opened 2 hours ago. Your shares are in a free fall, and your creditors are circling like sharks. You have nothing left to negotiate with." Preston pushed his way forward, a repulsive, arrogant smirk crawling onto his face. He reached inside his jacket and pulled out a thick manila envelope. He threw it violently onto my desk. The contents spilled out, scattering across my morning reports. They were photographs. Dozens of highly explicit, compromising photographs depicting me in deeply scandalous situations with various men. The images were incredibly detailed, showing my face perfectly aligned with bodies engaged in acts that would completely obliterate a corporate executive's public standing. We have a lot left to negotiate with, Preston sneered, crossing his arms over his chest. My father might be struggling with the board, but I have been busy. Wall Street hates a scandal, Rebecca. Your father's firm relies on a pristine, untouchable reputation to maintain investor trust. If these pictures hit the tabloids, the internet, and the inboxes of your biggest clients, Montgomery Capital will face a public relations nightmare. You will be a laughingstock. Richard leaned over the desk again, his breath hot and reeking of stale coffee. The terms are very simple, Rebecca. You are going to initiate an immediate buyout of Kensington Hotel's debt for $50 million. You will structure it as a silent acquisition, and you will leave our executive board entirely intact. You buy our debt today, or every news outlet in the country sees those photos tomorrow morning. The two lawyers behind them puffed out their chests, clearly proud of the extortion racket they had helped orchestrate. They expected me to panic. They expected me to beg, to cry, to frantically dial my father to authorize the transfer. They still thought they were dealing with the timid girl from their dining room table. I did not even flinch. I picked up one of the photographs, examining the artificial lighting and the slightly unnatural blending around the jawline. I sighed, feeling a profound sense of secondhand embarrassment for the men standing in front of me. I smoothly gathered the entire stack of photographs, tapping them against the desk to align the edges. Without breaking eye contact with Preston, I leaned over and fed the entire stack directly into the heavy-duty industrial shredder, humming quietly next to my desk. The machine devoured the blackmail material in seconds, grinding their threats into meaningless confetti. "What are you doing?" Preston yelled, stepping forward in shock. "We have digital copies. We will send them right now." "You will not send anything, Preston," I replied, my voice dripping with absolute condescension. My public relations and cybersecurity teams work around the clock. When you generated these pathetic deepfakes last night, our network monitors flagged the unusual facial recognition queries associated with my public profiles. They tracked the generation software's digital footprint. Preston's smug expression evaporated instantly. He took a hesitant step backward. "You are not a criminal mastermind, Preston," I continued, standing up from my chair to tower over him. "You are a desperate, lazy amateur. You did not even use a proxy server. You used your personal laptop connected to the Kensington Hotel's private Wi-Fi network, logged in under your own administrative credentials. My team traced the IP address directly back to your specific computer. We have the timestamps, the data packets, and the exact software licensing key registered to your personal credit card." Richard turned to look at his son, his eyes wide with horror as he realized Preston had just handed me the final nail for their coffins. "You used your own computer," Richard whispered, his voice cracking with absolute despair. I smiled, pressing a silver intercom button embedded in the surface of my desk. "You assumed I would pay $50 million to protect my reputation," I said smoothly. "But my reputation is flawless. Yours, however, is about to become a federal case study in stupidity." The glass doors to my office swung open again. My security guards stepped aside, making room for 4 individuals wearing dark windbreakers with bold yellow lettering across the back. The Federal Bureau of Investigation had arrived. Preston Kensington, the lead agent, announced, stepping into the room and holding up a freshly stamped document. "We have a federal warrant for your arrest on charges of cyber extortion, wire fraud, and the creation of non-consensual deepfake material. Put your hands behind your back." As the cold steel of the handcuffs clicked shut around Preston's wrists, the remaining air seemed to get sucked right out of my executive office. My former husband, a man who had spent the last 5 years dictating what I wore, how I spoke, and when I was allowed to breathe, was now reduced to a whimpering mess. He begged the federal agents to listen to him, his voice cracking as they read him his rights, and marched him toward the heavy glass doors. Richard stumbled backward, clutching his chest. The great patriarch of the Kensington Empire watched his only son being hauled off to a federal holding cell, completely powerless to stop it. Abigail wailed, dropping to her knees on the expensive rug, crying out for her husband to do something. But Malcolm was already gone. In the sheer chaos of the FBI raiding my executive suite, the brilliant chief financial officer had done exactly what a rat does when the ship starts sinking. He abandoned his wife, abandoned his father-in-law, and quietly slipped out through the private service elevator. Malcolm was a man of numbers, and the numbers told him that sticking around meant joining Preston in a federal indictment. I did not send my security guards after him. I let him run. A predator is always more predictable when they believe they have successfully escaped. 45 minutes later, a sleek black town car tore through the security gates of Teterboro Airport in New Jersey. Malcolm sat in the back seat, his fingers flying across the glowing screen of his tablet. He was frantically rerouting the $15 million he had embezzled, bouncing the funds between shell corporations in the Cayman Islands and anonymous accounts in Switzerland. He had his emergency go bag, his forged secondary passport, and a chartered Gulfstream jet waiting on the tarmac to fly him to a non-extradition country. As his car screeched to a halt next to the idling aircraft, Malcolm grabbed his leather duffel bag and sprinted up the metal steps of the plane. The biting night wind whipped at his expensive suit, but he was grinning. He had outsmarted the Kensingtons. He had outsmarted the federal agents. He thought he had outsmarted me. "Get us in the air right now," Malcolm barked, tossing his bag onto a plush leather seat as he stepped into the luxurious cabin. "Do not wait for clearance. I will pay whatever FAA fines they hit us with. Just fly." The pilot, a tall man in a crisp white uniform, did not move toward the cockpit. Instead, he calmly stepped aside, folding his hands behind his back. "I am afraid air traffic control has grounded this specific aircraft for the evening, Malcolm," I said, stepping out from the shadows of the rear cabin. Malcolm froze. The arrogant grin slid off his face, replaced by absolute, unadulterated terror. He looked at me, then looked at the pilot, then stared wildly at the closed cabin door behind him. He took a stumbling step backward, clutching his tablet to his chest like a shield. "How did you get here?" Malcolm demanded, his voice shaking as the reality of his situation crashed down on him. "This is a private charter. I booked this flight under a corporate pseudonym. You cannot just breach airport security and board my plane." "Your plane?" I asked, walking slowly down the center aisle of the jet, my heels sinking into the thick carpet. I stopped a few feet away from him and crossed my arms. "You booked a charter through Apex Aviation, Malcolm. Did you not bother to check who acquired Apex last fiscal quarter? Montgomery Capital owns this entire fleet? You just tried to use my father's aircraft to flee the country with money you stole from your own family." Malcolm swallowed hard, his eyes darting frantically around the confined space of the cabin. He realized he was entirely trapped. There was no secret exit. There was no financial loophole. He was standing inside a multi-million-dollar cage, and I held the only key. "You are trespassing," he stammered, pulling out his cell phone with trembling hands. "I am calling airport security. I will have you arrested." I reached into my blazer pocket and pulled out a thick legal document, dropping it onto the polished mahogany table separating us. "I would not make that call if I were you, because while you were busy running from the FBI, I was busy having my legal team draft this transfer of asset agreement." Malcolm stared at the document. "What is this?" "This is your way out," I said smoothly. "You currently hold a 15% equity stake in Kensington Hotels. You manipulated Richard into giving you those shares as a wedding gift when you married Abigail. I want them. You are going to sign your entire 15% over to Montgomery Capital right here, right now." "Are you out of your mind?" Malcolm yelled, his corporate composure completely disintegrating. "I am not giving you my equity. That 15% is the only legitimate leverage I have left. I am not signing anything." I tapped my fingers against the mahogany table. "If you do not sign that paper, Malcolm, I will take the black USB drive currently sitting in my purse and hand it directly to the Internal Revenue Service. The FBI is already dissecting Preston for cyber extortion, but the IRS will absolutely gut you for dodging federal taxes on $15 million of embezzled corporate funds. They will freeze your Cayman accounts by morning. You will not be flying to a tropical island. You will be sitting in a federal penitentiary for the next 2 decades." Malcolm stared at me, his chest heaving as he weighed his options. He looked at the transfer papers, then at my completely unyielding expression. He knew I was not bluffing. The mighty chief financial officer, The man who had treated me like an ignorant peasant for 5 years was utterly defeated. His hands shook violently as he reached into his jacket, pulled out a gold fountain pen, and scribbled his signature across the bottom of the contract. He threw the pen onto the table and backed away, his face pale and slick with sweat. "There, you have your precious 15%. You just stole my equity." I picked up the contract, checking the signature to ensure it was valid, and offered him a cold smile. "I did not steal anything, Malcolm. I simply made a better investment." Malcolm grabbed his leather duffel bag, his knuckles white with rage, as he turned toward the cabin door. But before he stepped out into the freezing night air, he stopped. He looked back over his shoulder, and a vicious, spiteful laugh escaped his throat. "You think you just played a brilliant hand, Rebecca?" Malcolm sneered, his eyes burning with malice. "You think taking my equity gives Montgomery Capital control of the Kensington brand? You have absolutely no idea what you just inherited." I narrowed my eyes. "What are you talking about?" "Richard lied to everyone," Malcolm said, a dark, twisted grin spreading across his face. "When the pension funds dried up, he did not just come to your father for a bailout. He was desperate. 6 months ago, Richard secretly collateralized the entire Kensington Hotel brand. He signed over the deeds to every single property we own. And he did not sign them over to a bank. He took a predatory loan from a ruthless financial syndicate out of Chicago, men who do not use lawyers when you miss a payment." Malcolm opened the cabin door, the howling wind rushing into the jet. "You did not just acquire a hotel empire, Rebecca. You just bought a death sentence." The heavy steel door of the Gulfstream sealed shut with a pressurized hiss, locking Malcolm inside his luxury cage to await the federal authorities. I stood on the freezing New Jersey tarmac and watched the flashing red and blue lights of the approaching FBI convoy reflect against the polished hull of the aircraft. Richard Kensington had mortgaged his entire family legacy to a violent Chicago syndicate. It was a pathetic, desperate move from a pathetic, desperate man. But it changed nothing about my strategy. Montgomery Capital possessed the financial leverage and the ruthless legal firepower to obliterate a shadow syndicate. The Kensingtons, however, had just lost their final shield. I turned my back on the plane and walked toward my waiting car. The hotel empire was finally mine. Now it was time to sweep up the remaining trash. By noon the following day, the financial world was completely upside down. Kensington Hotel's stock had crashed by 40%, triggering automatic trading halts across the exchange. Preston's mugshot was looping on every major news network, his arrogant face replaced by the hollow stare of a man facing decades in federal prison. I was sitting comfortably behind my massive mahogany desk at Montgomery Capital, reviewing the final asset forfeiture documents, when a shrill, hysterical scream pierced the quiet productivity of my executive floor. "Get your filthy hands off me," the voice shrieked. "Do you have any idea who I am? I will have you all fired." The heavy glass doors to my office violently swung open. Abigail Kensington burst into the room, her face red and distorted with fury. For the first time in the 5 years I had known her, the immaculate Kensington princess looked completely unhinged. Her designer trench coat was wrinkled, her perfect blonde blowout was a tangled mess, and her mascara was slightly smeared. 2 of my tactical security guards were right behind her, their hands reaching out to physically remove her from the premises. I raised a single hand, signaling the guards to stand down. They immediately stepped back, flanking the door, their eyes locked onto the frantic woman breathing heavily in the center of my office. "You froze his accounts!" Abigail screamed, marching right up to the edge of my desk. Her voice was painfully loud, vibrating with a toxic mix of entitlement and sheer panic. "You froze everything. The bank rejected my black card this morning at Bergdorf Goodman. They declined my wire transfers. I have absolutely zero access to my own money, Rebecca." "It is not your money, Abigail," I replied, my voice completely devoid of emotion. I leaned back in my leather chair, staring at her with cold indifference. "The federal government froze those accounts because they contain $15 million of stolen corporate capital. You are married to a federal criminal. Your assets are part of an active embezzlement investigation. I am a victim here. Abigail wailed, slamming her manicured hands down on my desk. She leaned forward, trying to force tears into her eyes, playing the same manipulative game she had used her entire life to escape accountability. I trusted Malcolm. He lied to me. I had absolutely no idea he was stealing from my father's company. I am a victim of financial abuse. You ruined my husband, you ruined my family's reputation, and now you owe me a payout. I want $5 million wired to a secure private account by the end of the day to cover my distress and my legal fees, or I will go to the press and tell them you framed us. I stared at her for a long, silent moment. The sheer audacity of her delusion was almost impressive. Without breaking eye contact, I slowly reached into the top drawer of my desk and pulled out a thick, heavy black binder. I dropped it onto the polished wood directly in front of her. The binder hit the desk with a loud, satisfying thud. "Open it," I commanded. Abigail glared at me, her chest heaving, but she reached out and flipped the heavy cover open. The color instantly drained from her flushed face. Inside the binder were hundreds of pages of itemized receipts, bank statements, and luxury purchase orders. I had my forensic accounting team pull every single transaction linked to Malcolm's offshore shell corporations. "You claim you had no idea he was stealing," I said, my voice dropping to a lethal quiet register. Yet this binder documents exactly where Malcolm's embezzled funds were being funneled over the last 9 months. He did not hide the money, Abigail. He spent it on you. I stood up, walking slowly around the edge of my desk. "You spent $1.2 million on a custom flawless diamond necklace from a private dealer in Antwerp," I stated, listing the offenses clearly. "You purchased 2 vintage Porsche 911s through an anonymous broker for $800,000. You spent $400,000 on exclusive Hermès Birkin bags in Paris. You dropped another $1 million on complete interior renovations for your Miami yacht. All of these transactions were authorized by you, signed by you, and funded directly from the dummy accounts Malcolm used to bleed Kensington hotels dry." Abigail stumbled backward, her hands flying away from the binder as if the paper itself were burning her. "Malcolm told me his investments were paying off," she stammered, her voice shaking violently. "He told me it was his bonus money. I did not know it was stolen." "Ignorance is not a legal defense when your signature is on the wire transfers." "Abigail," I said smoothly, stopping just a few feet away from her, "you spent $4 million of stolen money in less than a year. You are not a victim of financial abuse. You are an accessory to grand larceny. You are a co-conspirator." The reality of her situation finally shattered her delusion. The pampered princess realized she was not getting a payout. She was getting indicted. The panic in her eyes morphed instantly into feral, uncontrolled rage. "You ruined my life!" Abigail shrieked at the top of her lungs. She lunged at me, her hands raised like claws, aiming directly for my face. She was completely blinded by her own venom. She did not even make it 2 steps. My security guards moved with devastating precision. One guard grabbed her outstretched arm, twisting it sharply downward, while the other tackled her shoulders, driving her forcefully into the expensive hardwood floor. Abigail screamed in shock and pain as her face was pressed hard against the floorboards, her designer coat bunching up awkwardly around her waist. She thrashed wildly, kicking her expensive heels against the floor, but the guards held her pinned, completely neutralizing the threat in seconds. "Let me go!" she sobbed hysterically, her cheek smashed against the wood. "I am a Kensington. You cannot do this to me. You are a criminal with terrible spending habits." I corrected her, walking over and looking down at her pathetic, struggling form. "And since you love your luxury purchases so much, I think you should know what is happening to them right now." Abigail stopped thrashing, her tear-streaked face looking up at me in absolute terror. "What are you talking about?" "While you were busy storming into my office to demand a ransom, my asset recovery division was busy executing a federal seizure order," I explained, checking my gold wristwatch. "Right now, a team of federal marshals and private repossession agents are standing inside your luxury penthouse. They are seizing the diamond necklaces. They are towing the vintage Porsches. They are bagging up the designer handbags. Every single item you purchased with stolen money is currently being loaded into an evidence truck." "No," Abigail screamed, a guttural sound of pure, unadulterated agony. No, you cannot take my things. It is my home. Right on cue, a muffled ringing sound echoed from Abigail's discarded designer purse, lying on the floor near my desk. I walked over, picked up the bag, and pulled out her glowing smartphone. The caller ID flashed brightly on the screen. It was her building manager. I swiped to answer the call and pressed the speakerphone button, holding the device out so Abigail could hear her entire world collapsing. Mrs. Kensington. The frantic voice of the building manager echoed through the executive office. I am so sorry to bother you, but federal agents just seized your entire residence. The property has been officially confiscated under asset forfeiture laws. I have been legally instructed to deactivate your security fobs and revoke your building access. You cannot return to the premises. The line went dead. The click of the disconnected call echoed like a gunshot. I tossed the phone onto the floor next to her head. My guards released their hold and stepped back, leaving her completely unrestrained. But Abigail did not try to attack me again. She did not scream. The fight completely drained out of her body. She slowly pushed herself up onto her knees, her hands trembling violently in her lap. The untouchable socialite, the woman who had tormented me and mocked my existence for 5 years, was now homeless, penniless, and facing federal prison. Abigail looked up at me, tears carving dark tracks through her ruined makeup. She clasped her hands together, pressing them against her chest. Please, Rebecca, Abigail begged, her voice a pathetic, broken whisper as she kneeled at my feet. Please, I have nothing. I have nowhere to go. Please show me some mercy. Mercy, I repeated softly, staring down at Abigail's ruined, tear-streaked face. Mercy is for the honest. Mercy is for the innocent. Mercy is for the people who do not spend 5 years funding their vanity with stolen capital while treating their sister-in-law like a peasant. I gestured to the 2 security guards standing at the door. They immediately stepped forward, grabbing Abigail by her arms and hauling her roughly to her feet. She kicked and thrashed, screaming obscenities that echoed off the glass walls of my office, but it was entirely useless. They dragged her out of the executive suite, her frantic shrieks fading into the distance as the elevator doors sealed shut. She walked into my office demanding a $5 million payout. She left with absolutely nothing. Nothing but the clothes on her back. Nothing but the cold realization of her own greed. Nothing but the crushing weight of her impending federal indictment. By 9 o'clock that evening, a torrential thunderstorm had descended upon Manhattan. The sky was a bruised, violent purple, and the rain fell in thick, blinding sheets, flooding the gutters and washing the filth from the city streets. I sat in the back of my armored town car as it pulled up to the curb outside my high-security apartment building on the Upper East Side. The doorman rushed out, but my lead security guard, Marcus, was already stepping out of the passenger side, opening an enormous black umbrella to shield me from the deluge. I stepped out of the warm car into the freezing night air, adjusting the collar of my trench coat. Rebecca. The voice was harsh, desperate, and completely raw. It sliced through the sound of the pounding rain. Marcus instantly dropped his hand to the holster at his waist, stepping in front of me to block the threat. I placed a calm hand on Marcus's shoulder and peered into the darkness beyond the glow of the street lamps. A figure stepped out from the shadows of the alleyway. It was Preston. The immaculate, untouchable Kensington air looked like a drowned rat. He was completely soaked to the bone, shivering violently in the freezing rain. His custom-tailored suits had been seized by federal agents that morning, leaving him wearing a cheap, ill-fitting gray tracksuit. His hair was plastered to his forehead, and his eyes were bloodshot and wild. He had spent the last 12 hours sitting in a federal holding cell before a bail bondsman finally agreed to take a massive risk on him. He was out on bail, but his life was entirely over. His assets were frozen. His credit cards were declined. His prestigious friends had stopped answering his frantic phone calls. "You ruined my life!" Preston screamed, his voice cracking as he stumbled forward. Marcus took a defensive stance, but I held my ground perfectly still under the umbrella, letting Preston stand in the pouring rain. "You ruined your own life, Preston," I replied, my voice steady and completely devoid of empathy. "You lied, you cheated, you engaged in a massive corporate conspiracy. You built your entire existence on a foundation of absolute fraud. "It is not fair," he wailed, wiping the heavy rain from his eyes. He threw his hands up, playing the victim just as he had done his entire life. The judge froze every single account. The banks locked me out. I had to beg a shady bondsman just to get out of that cell. "You trapped me, Rebecca. You set me up from the very beginning. You played the quiet, submissive little nobody perfectly. You tricked me into signing that prenuptial agreement." I stared at him, fascinated by his complete inability to take accountability. "I did not force you to sleep with your assistant Preston. If I knew you were a billionaire, I never would have cheated," he cried out, his voice echoing loudly against the brick buildings. "If I knew you were a Montgomery, I would have treated you like a queen. I would have given you whatever you wanted. You hid your wealth. You hid your power. You tricked me into breaking the rules because you knew I thought you were worthless." The sheer pathetic honesty of his statement hung heavily in the freezing air. He was not apologizing for betraying his marriage vows. He was not apologizing for the profound emotional abuse he had inflicted upon me for 5 years. He was apologizing for miscalculating my net worth. He only respected money. He only respected power. He only regretted his actions because the woman he thought was a peasant turned out to be the executioner. I reached into my leather briefcase, keeping it safely shielded from the rain beneath the umbrella. I pulled out a thick legal folder sealed in a waterproof sleeve. I stepped forward, remaining perfectly dry, and held the folder out into the rain. Preston stared at it, his hands shaking as he reached out and took the slick plastic. "What is this?" he asked, his teeth chattering from the cold. "That is your finalized divorce decree," I said smoothly. "My legal team expedited the filing through a private judge this afternoon. Our marriage is officially dissolved, and because you publicly paraded your pregnant mistress in front of 800 witnesses, the infidelity penalty clause has been fully activated." Preston tore the plastic sleeve open, his wet fingers fumbling with the heavy legal parchment inside. He squinted through the pouring rain, reading the summary judgment on the first page. "The penalty is $100 million, I explained, my voice cutting through the sound of the thunder. "Since the Kensington assets are entirely frozen by the federal government and heavily leveraged to a violent Chicago syndicate, the judge granted me a direct permanent lien against you. I own everything you have left. I own everything you will ever earn. I own every trust fund, every hidden offshore account, and every single dime that ever passes through your hands for the rest of your miserable life. You are going to spend decades in federal prison, and when you finally get out, you will be working exclusively to pay off your debt to me." Preston stared at the glowing numbers printed on the wet paper. The realization hit him with the force of a freight train. He had nothing. He had absolutely nothing. The Chicago syndicate was actively hunting his father. The federal government was actively prosecuting him. And now he was permanently indentured to the woman he had spent 5 years treating like garbage. A low guttural sound clawed its way out of Preston's throat. It was not a sob. It was a sound of pure, unadulterated, violent rage. His face contorted into a mask of absolute hatred. He dropped the divorce papers, letting them fall into a muddy puddle at his feet. He lunged forward, plunging his hand deep into the pocket of his soaked jacket. He ripped out a heavy metallic weapon, raising his arm directly toward my chest. The dull gleam of the barrel caught the dim streetlight before it was instantly obscured by a violent blur of motion. Before Preston could level the heavy steel weapon at my heart, a shadow detached itself from the brick wall of the alleyway. The movement was a display of calculated, terrifying violence. It was not Marcus who intercepted him. It was William Montgomery. My father moved with a brutal efficiency that defied his age. His large hand clamped down over Preston's wrist like a steel vise, violently twisting the arm upward until a sickening snap echoed over the pounding rain. Preston shrieked, his fingers instinctively uncurling. The gun dropped. The heavy metal hit the flooded pavement. The heavy metal sank into the muddy water. The heavy metal was completely useless, just like the man who had tried to wield it. My father did not let go. He drove his knee directly into Preston's abdomen, folding the younger man in half. With a final effortless shove, William threw Preston backward. The Kensington heir slammed hard into the brick wall and slid down into the freezing puddle, clutching his shattered wrist, gasping for air. His lungs refused to take. My father stood towering over the pathetic, shivering mess of a man. William straightened his bespoke lapels, completely ignoring the torrential downpour soaking his shoulders. He looked down at Preston with eyes that held no anger, only the cold, absolute certainty of an executioner. "You thought she was an orphan," my father said, his deep voice carrying a lethal resonance that cut perfectly through the storm. "You thought she was an orphan with no one to protect her. You thought you could parade your arrogance around her, use her, discard her, and leave her bleeding. Now you get to see what happens when a Montgomery protects their own." Preston spat blood into the rain, his chest heaving as he stared up at the man who had just dismantled him in seconds. The reality of his colossal misjudgment was finally sinking into his fractured mind. He had spent 5 years treating me like a charity case, entirely unaware he was sleeping next to the sole heiress of a financial dynasty capable of buying and selling his family a dozen times over. "You let her do this." Preston choked out his eyes, darting frantically between me and the towering titan of Wall Street. "You let her destroy my family." "I let her claim what was rightfully hers," my father corrected, stepping closer until the toe of his leather shoe was inches from Preston's face. "She built the strategy. She laid the traps. She outsmarted your father. She outsmarted your financial officer, and she absolutely ruined you. I simply watched from the shadows. But the second you pull a weapon on my blood, you deal with me. You deal with the entire unyielding weight of the Montgomery Empire." Red and blue lights suddenly bathed the flooded street in a harsh, strobing glare. The sirens wailed, drowning out the thunder. 2 unmarked federal SUVs and a heavily armored police cruiser screeched to a halt, blocking both ends of the alleyway. Marcus had triggered his silent panic alarm the second Preston's hand went into his pocket. Heavily armed officers swarmed the wet pavement, their flashlights cutting through the rain, pinning Preston against the brick wall. They did not read him his rights gently. They slammed him onto the hood of the nearest cruiser, ripping his arms behind his back. He screamed in agony as the metal cuffs clamped down over his broken wrist. The charges were being shouted at him over the driving rain. Armed assault, attempted murder, felony violation of federal bail. Preston screamed. He begged. He bargained. He screamed for his high-priced lawyers. He begged for a shred of mercy. He bargained with empty promises of restitution. It was the exact same cycle of pathetic desperation he had shown his entire life. The arresting officer shoved him forcefully into the back of the armored transport. There would be no shady bail bondsman this time. There would be no frantic calls to influential friends or corrupt judges. His bail was automatically and permanently revoked. He was going straight to a maximum security holding cell, and he was never coming out. I watched the cruiser speed away into the dark, rainy night, taking the final pathetic remnants of Preston Kensington with it. The storm raged on as Marcus escorted my father and me safely into the warm, dry interior of my armored town car. The heavy doors locked, sealing out the chaos of the city. I poured 2 glasses of scotch from the car's private bar, handing one to my father. We did not need to speak. The silence in the cabin was a shared victory. The silence was an acknowledgement of absolute control. The silence was suddenly shattered by the sharp ringing of my private cell phone. I pulled the device from my trench coat pocket. The caller ID flashed brightly in the dim cabin. It was Richard Kensington. I answered the call, pressing the phone to my ear. I expected to hear a broken patriarch begging for the survival of his son. I expected to hear absolute, unconditional surrender. Instead, a harsh, grating sound blasted through the speaker. It was laughter. Richard Kensington was laughing maniacally, the sound completely untethered from reality. It was the chilling, desperate sound of a man who had completely lost his mind and decided to dance with the devil. "You think you won, Rebecca?" Richard wheezed, his breath catching as he laughed again. "You think locking my son in a federal cage gives you the keys to my empire? You are a fool. You are nothing but an arrogant, overconfident little fool." "Your son is facing 20 years, Richard," I replied calmly, sipping my scotch. "Your daughter is penniless. Your brand is fully leveraged to a shadow syndicate. You have absolutely no moves left to make." "I have the only move that matters." Richard spat, his voice dropping into a vicious, triumphant sneer. "The Chicago syndicate just wired the funds. The money hit the corporate accounts 5 minutes ago. The debt is entirely cleared. The cash flow is secured. I am calling an emergency shareholder meeting at dawn to permanently block Montgomery Capital out of the business. You are finished, Rebecca. You are entirely finished. I lowered the phone from my ear as the line went dead. Richard Kensington's maniacal laughter was still ringing in the confined space of the armored town car. He genuinely believed he had won. He genuinely believed that securing a predatory loan from a violent criminal syndicate was a stroke of absolute genius. I looked across the leather interior at my father. William Montgomery was already reading a completely different set of documents on his encrypted tablet. He did not even look up. "Drive," my father ordered Marcus. "We have a board meeting." While our cars sped toward the financial district, an entirely different scene was playing out in the opulent multi-level Kensington penthouse overlooking Central Park. I knew exactly what was happening because my corporate espionage team had compromised Richard's internal security network 3 months ago. The audio feed piped directly into my earpiece, crisp and perfectly clear. Richard was celebrating. I could hear the sharp clink of heavy crystal as he poured himself a massive measure of imported scotch. "We did it!" Richard shouted, his voice echoing off the vaulted ceilings of his residence. "Do you hear me? We are completely untouchable. That arrogant little nobody thought she could steal my empire. She thought she could orchestrate a hostile takeover. But she drastically underestimated who she was dealing with. I am Richard Kensington. I built this city. I am a titan of industry. A little girl with a fat bank account does not intimidate me." A pathetic, wet sniffling sound interrupted his grand monologue. It was Abigail. After my security team had unceremoniously dumped her on the street and federal agents had seized her marital penthouse, she had nowhere else to run. She had fled to her father's residence, shivering, completely stripped of her designer armor and demanding comfort. But Richard had absolutely no comfort to offer. He was drunk on his perceived victory. "Stop crying, Abigail," Richard snapped. The audio feed picked up his heavy footsteps pacing across the marble floor. "Your husband is a total failure. Preston was always weak. He let a woman outsmart him. He let her trap him. But I am not Preston. I just secured a massive cash injection. $50 million wired directly into our primary holding accounts. The company is completely solvent. The board of directors will have absolutely no choice but to reinstate me and permanently block Montgomery Capital from acquiring our voting shares." "But my things," Abigail sobbed, her voice high and grating. "Rebecca took my diamonds. The feds took my cars. I have nothing, Dad. She treated me like a beggar. You have to destroy her." "I already have," Richard boasted, slamming his glass down onto a table. He was practically vibrating with arrogance. "You think Standard Banks would touch us with Preston facing a federal indictment? No. But I know how the real world operates. I went to Chicago. I sat down with men who do not play by Wall Street regulations. I negotiated a private unlisted loan from a syndicate that operates entirely in the shadows. They gave me the capital to crush Rebecca, and all I had to do was put up the Kensington legacy deeds as collateral. It was a brilliant, highly calculated risk. I leveraged the brick and mortar to save the soul of the company. When the market opens, Rebecca Montgomery is going to realize she just spent millions of dollars to acquire a completely empty shell." I reached up and pulled the earpiece out. I had heard enough. The storm had finally broken by the time we arrived at the Montgomery Capital headquarters. The early morning sun was just beginning to pierce through the heavy gray clouds, casting long, sharp shadows across the concrete canyons of the financial district. My father and I walked in perfect silence into the primary executive boardroom. The room was massive, lined with soundproof glass and dominated by a custom-cut obsidian conference table. Spread out across the center of the table were the exact loan documents Richard Kensington was currently celebrating. I took my seat at the head of the table. My father remained standing, slowly unbuttoning his suit jacket. He picked up the heavy stack of contracts, his eyes scanning the aggressive interest rates, the brutal default clauses, and the absolute forfeiture of the Kensington property deeds. "Richard is a remarkably stupid man," William said, his voice a low, terrifying rumble in the quiet room. "He operates under the delusion that criminal syndicates generate their own capital. He actually believes that these men in Chicago magically materialize $50 million in liquid cash to hand out to desperate hotel tycoons. He was desperate, I replied, crossing my arms and leaning back. Desperation makes a man blind to the machinery operating right above his head. My father smiled. It was a cold, predatory expression. He dropped the documents back onto the obsidian table and picked up a heavy gold fountain pen. These shadow syndicates are violent, my father explained smoothly, unscrewing the cap of the pen. They are ruthless. They are excellent at breaking legs and enforcing collections. But they are entirely dependent on legitimate financial institutions to launder, hold, and supply their capital. They need a primary liquidity provider. They need a bank that does not ask questions and has the power to shield their massive cash reserves from federal regulators. The Chicago Syndicate is a blunt instrument. We are the hand that wields it. William leaned over the table. And Montgomery Capital has been the primary liquidity provider for the Chicago Syndicate for the last 15 years, he stated. He pressed the gold nib of the pen against the final page of the transfer agreement. With a few sharp, elegant strokes, my father signed his name. He authorized the legal transfer of the debt. Richard Kensington did not outsmart anyone. He did not find a secret loophole to save his company. In his absolute panic to escape my hostile takeover, Richard had gone to the criminal underworld to borrow $50 million. But that money belonged to us. Montgomery Capital had supplied the syndicate with the exact funds they loaned to Richard. I picked up the signed document, looking at the fresh ink. Richard just put up the deeds to every single Kensington Hotel as collateral, I said quietly, a genuine smile finally touching my lips. And he handed those deeds directly to us. He just borrowed his own destruction using our money. My father buttoned his jacket and walked toward the boardroom doors. The market opens in exactly 1 hour, Rebecca. Call the emergency shareholder meeting. It is time to let Richard know who actually owns his legacy. I picked up the secure desk phone, dialing the direct line to my lead corporate counsel. The time for playing financial chess was officially over. It was time to clear the board entirely. Execute the covenant. I instructed, my voice echoing coldly off the obsidian table. Trigger the material adverse change clause in the Chicago Syndicate loan. My legal team had drafted that specific contract with absolute predatory precision. We knew Richard would not read the fine print in his frantic rush for capital. Buried on page 74 was a standard but lethal margin call provision. If Kensington Hotels or any of its executive officers became the subject of a formal federal investigation, the lender had the absolute right to demand immediate repayment in full plus triple damages for institutional risk. Malcolm's embezzlement indictment, along with the subsequent SEC probe into the company's accounting practices, provided the perfect unavoidable trigger. Less than 10 minutes later, across the city in his sprawling penthouse, Richard Kensington's celebration came to a violent, catastrophic halt. He was holding a fresh glass of imported scotch, still boasting to a shivering Abigail about his absolute brilliance, when his private secure tablet chimed with a high-priority legal alert. Richard swiped the screen with a smug grin, expecting a confirmation receipt from the holding company. Instead, his eyes locked onto a formal declaration of default. The color drained from Richard's face, leaving him looking like a polished corpse. The heavy crystal glass slipped from his fingers, shattering against the marble floor and sending expensive liquor splashing across Abigail's bare ankles. She shrieked and jumped back, but Richard did not even blink. He was paralyzed, staring at the glowing screen in sheer, unadulterated terror. "What is it?" Abigail demanded, her voice shrill with rising panic. "Dad, what did they say?" "They called the loan." Richard choked out, his chest heaving as if the air had been sucked out of the penthouse. "They invoked a penalty clause because of Malcolm, because of the federal indictment. They are demanding immediate repayment." "Then just pay it back," Abigail cried, waving her hands frantically. "You just said they gave you $50 million. Just send it back to them." Richard looked up at his daughter, his eyes wide and bloodshot. The arrogance that had defined his entire existence was completely gone, replaced by the hollow stare of a dead man walking. "It is not $50 million, Abigail. The penalty clause includes institutional risk damages. They are demanding $150 million in liquid cash." And I have exactly 24 hours to wire the funds or they execute the collateral clause. They take 100% of the Kensington Hotel assets. They take the deeds. They take everything. Abigail collapsed onto the pristine white sofa, burying her face in her hands, realizing that her father had not saved them at all. He had just handed the executioner a heavier axe. Richard did not waste another second. He lunged across the room, snatching his cell phone from the mahogany console. He was Richard Kensington. He was a titan of Manhattan real estate. He had spent 4 decades building a network of the most powerful, influential men in the world. He just needed a bridge loan, a temporary massive cash injection to cover the margin call until he could liquidate some international holdings. He scrolled frantically through his contacts, dialing Arthur Sterling, a private equity billionaire he had played golf with every Sunday for 15 years. The phone rang twice before Arthur answered. Arthur, thank God, Richard breathed, pacing rapidly across the ruined marble floor. I am in a slight liquidity bind, a misunderstanding with a shadow lender. I need a bridge loan of $150 million. I will pay you 20% interest the second my accounts are unfrozen. Richard Arthur said, his voice completely devoid of its usual country club warmth. I cannot help you. What are you talking about? Richard snapped, his panic making him aggressive. You have billions in liquid capital. I am good for it. You know I am good for it. I am putting up the Kensington brand as collateral. The Kensington brand is toxic waste, Arthur replied coldly. And your name is blacklisted. William Montgomery sent a very quiet, very explicit memo across Wall Street this morning. Anyone who extends a single dime of credit to the Kensington family will be considered a hostile entity to Montgomery Capital. No one is going to commit financial suicide to save you, Richard. Do not call this number again. The line went dead. Richard stared at his phone, his hand shaking violently. He dialed another number, a hedge fund manager he had known since college. The call went straight to voicemail. He dialed a prominent investment banker who owed him a massive favor. The assistant answered and politely informed him the banker was unavailable indefinitely. For 2 agonizing hours, Richard Kensington dialed every single wealthy friend, every powerful associate, and every corporate ally he possessed. Every single one of them hung up on him. William Montgomery had built an invisible, impenetrable wall around the Kensington family, starving them of the only oxygen they needed to survive. Richard threw his phone across the room, letting out a roar of absolute despair. The 24-hour countdown was ticking away, and he was completely, utterly isolated. The mighty patriarch had been reduced to a cornered animal backed against a wall with absolutely no escape route. Abigail looked up from the sofa, her face a mask of ruined makeup and sheer terror. What are we going to do? She whispered, her voice trembling. We are going to lose everything. We are going to be on the street. Richard stood entirely still, his breathing ragged. He stared out the floor-to-ceiling windows at the Manhattan skyline, a skyline he used to believe he owned. He had one option left. It was the most humiliating, degrading option imaginable, but it was the only door William Montgomery had not explicitly locked. Get my coat, Richard commanded, his voice hollow and defeated. Where are you going? Abigail asked, shrinking back from the dark intensity in his eyes. I am going to Montgomery Capital, Richard stated, his jaw clenched so tightly it looked like his teeth might shatter. William blocked my financing to force a complete capitulation. He wants to see me crawl. He wants me to beg for a buyout directly from the source. I am going to walk into that building, and I am going to grovel to the CEO to save whatever scraps of my legacy are left. Richard grabbed his jacket and marched out of the penthouse, preparing himself to face the ultimate humiliation of begging the Montgomery patriarch for mercy. He stepped onto his private elevator, his stomach churning with dread, entirely unaware that William Montgomery was not the CEO. He was blindly marching directly into the jaws of the woman he had spent 5 years treating like dirt. The heavy steel of the firearm gleamed under the harsh glow of the street lamps. But before Preston could level the barrel at my heart, a towering figure detached itself from the absolute darkness of the alleyway. The intervention was a display of calculated, terrifying violence. It was not Marcus who intercepted the threat. It was William Montgomery. My father moved with a brutal, terrifying efficiency that completely defied his age. His large hand clamped down over Preston's wrist, like an industrial vice violently twisting the arm upward, until a sickening snap echoed clearly over the pounding rain. Preston shrieked, his fingers instinctively uncurling in agony. The heavy weapon dropped from his grasp, hitting the flooded pavement with a dull splash and sliding uselessly into the muddy water. My father did not let go. He drove his knee directly into Preston's abdomen, folding the younger man in half, expelling every ounce of air from his lungs. With a final effortless surge of raw power, William threw Preston backward. The Kensington air slammed hard against the rough brick wall and slid down into the freezing puddle, clutching his shattered wrist. Gasping for breath, his lungs refused to take. My father stood towering over the pathetic, shivering mess of a man. William straightened his bespoke lapels, completely ignoring the torrential downpour soaking his shoulders. He looked down at Preston with eyes that held no anger, only the cold, absolute certainty of an executioner. This was the man who had spent 5 years watching his daughter endure the Kensington family's psychological torment, silently waiting for the precise moment to strike. He had watched them force me to sit at the far end of the holiday tables. He had read the private reports of Preston squandering my supposed allowance on cheap jewelry for his mistresses. William had held his wrath in check purely out of respect for my strategic vision, but that restraint was officially gone. "You thought she was an orphan?" My father stated, his deep voice carrying a lethal resonance that cut perfectly through the raging storm. "You slapped her. You paraded your mistresses in front of her. You treated her like a peasant because you believed she had absolutely no one in this world to protect her." William stepped closer, the toe of his expensive leather shoe pressing into Preston's soaked tracksuit. "You miscalculated entirely," my father continued, his tone dropping to a terrifying register. "Now you get to see exactly what happens when a Montgomery protects their own." Preston spat rainwater and blood onto the pavement, his chest heaving as he stared up at the man who had just dismantled him in seconds. The sheer humiliation of his reality crashed over him as the freezing rain soaked through his cheap gray clothes. The reality of his colossal mistake was finally sinking into his fractured mind. He had spent his entire marriage treating me like a charity case, completely unaware he was sleeping next to the sole heiress of a financial dynasty, capable of buying and selling his family a dozen times over. Before Preston could formulate a pathetic response, red and blue lights suddenly bathed the flooded street in a harsh, strobing glare. The wail of sirens drowned out the thunder. 2 unmarked federal SUVs and a heavily armored police cruiser screeched to a halt, completely blocking both ends of the alleyway. Marcus had triggered his silent panic alarm the exact second Preston's hand went into his pocket. Heavily armed officers swarmed the wet pavement, their flashlights cutting through the thick rain, pinning Preston against the brick wall. They did not read him his rights gently. They slammed him onto the hood of the nearest cruiser, ripping his arms behind his back. Preston screamed in fresh agony as the metal cuffs clamped down over his freshly broken wrist. The charges were being shouted at him over the driving rain. Armed assault, attempted murder, felony violation of federal bail conditions. "You cannot do this to me!" Preston screamed, his voice cracking as he thrashed against the officers. "I am a Kensington. You know my father. You know who we are. Call my lawyers. Call my father right now." "Your father cannot save you, Preston," I replied calmly, remaining perfectly dry beneath the umbrella Marcus held over me. "Your father cannot even save himself." The arresting officer shoved him forcefully into the back of the armored transport. There would be no shady bail bondsman this time. There would be no frantic calls to influential friends or corrupt judges. By drawing a weapon, Preston had sealed his own fate. His bail was automatically and permanently revoked. He was going straight to a maximum security holding cell, and he was absolutely never coming out. I watched the cruiser speed away into the dark, rainy night, taking the final pathetic remnants of Preston Kensington with it. The flashing lights faded, leaving the street quiet except for the steady rhythm of the rain. Marcus escorted my father and me safely into the warm, dry interior of my armored town car, the heavy doors locked, sealing out the chaos of the city. I poured 2 glasses of scotch from the car's private bar, handing one to my father. We did not need to speak. The silence in the cabin was a shared victory. It was an acknowledgement of absolute control. The Kensington air was neutralized. The board was nearly cleared. The silence was suddenly shattered by the sharp ringing of my private cell phone. I pulled the device from my trench coat pocket. The caller ID flashed brightly in the dim cabin. It was Richard Kensington. I answered the call, pressing the phone to my ear, expecting to hear a broken patriarch begging for the survival of his son. I expected to hear absolute unconditional surrender. Instead, a harsh, grating sound blasted through the speaker. It was laughter. Richard Kensington was laughing maniacally, the sound bouncing off the leather walls of the car. It was not the confident chuckle of a seasoned CEO. It was the frantic, manic cackle of a man who had backed himself into a corner and decided to set the entire building on fire. "You think you won, Rebecca." Richard wheezed, his breath catching as he laughed again. "You think locking my useless son in a federal cage gives you the keys to my empire? You are a fool. You are nothing but an arrogant, overconfident little fool." "Your son is facing 20 years, Richard," I replied calmly, sipping my scotch. "Your daughter is penniless. Your brand is fully leveraged. You have absolutely no moves left to make." "I have the only move that matters," Richard spat, his voice dropping into a vicious, triumphant sneer. "I just outsmarted you and your entire miserable family. You thought Standard Bank's freezing my assets would stop me? I went to the streets. I went to the real operators. The Chicago syndicate just wired the funds. The money hit the corporate accounts 5 minutes ago. The debt is entirely cleared. The cash flow is secured. I am calling an emergency shareholder meeting at dawn to permanently block Montgomery Capital out of the business. You are finished, Rebecca. You are entirely finished." Richard dropped to his knees, his expensive suit pooling around him on the polished floor of my executive office. He was crying. The great Richard Kensington, the titan of Manhattan real estate, was openly sobbing, begging his beloved daughter-in-law to save his legacy. I leaned forward, resting my elbows on the obsidian desk, and looked down at him. "Go find another table, Richard," I whispered softly. "This one is for family." He crawled out of my office a broken man. He crawled out stripped of his pride. He crawled out stripped of his power. He crawled out with nothing left but the crushing weight of his impending ruin. But rats always scatter when the ship begins to sink. Less than 4 hours later, my private security detail alerted me to a new arrival in the lobby. It was Abigail. She had bypassed the frantic chaos unfolding at the Kensington estate, slipping past her father's crumbling defenses to secure her own survival. When Marcus escorted her into my office, she looked nothing like the arrogant socialite who had demanded a $5 million payout just days ago. She looked hunted. She was sweating. She was shaking. She was clutching a heavy black leather book to her chest as if it were a life preserver. Abigail slammed the heavy ledger down onto my desk. The worn leather landed with a thick, satisfying thud. "This is his blood," she said, her voice manic and breathless. "This is his actual blood, Rebecca. It is my father's private ledger. It contains every single offshore account, every shell company in the Cayman Islands, every illicit wire transfer he ever made to avoid federal taxes. It is decades of tax evasion. It is a guaranteed federal indictment." I looked at the black book, then slowly raised my eyes to meet hers. "You stole from your own father," I noted calmly. "He failed!" she snapped, pacing frantically across my office. She gestured wildly, her perfectly manicured nails catching the overhead lights. "He told me he was going to fix it. He told me he was going to outsmart you. But he failed, just like Preston failed. I am not going to federal prison because of their stupidity. I am not going to live on the street." I watched him input the code to the secondary safe behind the painting in his study. I waited until he locked himself in the master bathroom to swallow his blood pressure pills. I took the ledger and I walked right out the front door. I am smarter than him. I am smarter than Preston. I know how to survive. I am offering you the final nail in his coffin. she continued, leaning heavily over my desk. Her eyes were wide with desperate greed. I am handing you the absolute destruction of the Kensington patriarch. I want my penthouse back, she demanded, her voice rising in pitch. I want the deed transferred fully into my name. And I want a monthly allowance of $50,000. It is pocket change for Montgomery Capital. You give me my life back, and you get to lock my father in a federal penitentiary for the rest of his miserable life. We have a deal. We have to have a deal. I reached out and pulled the heavy ledger toward me. The leather was worn from years of Richard's frantic accounting. I flipped open the thick pages. The ink was meticulous. The columns were perfectly aligned. The sheer volume of illicit wealth hidden from the United States government was staggering. It was the exact piece of evidence my corporate espionage team had been hunting for months. Abigail had simply walked into her father's private study, cracked his secondary safe, and handed it directly to the enemy. She wanted her penthouse. She wanted her status. She wanted her illusion of power. I closed the ledger. The sound echoed sharply in the quiet room. No, I said smoothly. Abigail froze. The manic energy drained from her face, leaving behind a mask of absolute confusion. What do you mean, no? I just handed you his head on a silver platter. I pulled a secure tablet across my desk. I connected the high-resolution scanner and placed the ledger face down on the glass. The bright light swept across the first page, digitizing the offshore accounts. I mean no, Abigail, I replied, my voice completely devoid of emotion. I do not negotiate with terrorists. I do not negotiate with parasites. I do not negotiate with women who spent 5 years treating me like an uneducated peasant while living off stolen capital. You cannot do this, she shrieked, lunging forward to grab the ledger. Marcus stepped forward, placing a massive hand squarely on her chest and shoving her back into the leather guest chair. She collapsed into the seat, hyperventilating, as she watched the scanner light sweep back and forth. Every single page of this ledger is currently being uploaded to an encrypted server, I explained methodically. And that server is currently routing the entire file directly to the primary investigative division of the Internal Revenue Service. I am not buying this information from you, Abigail. I am simply taking it. You walked in here expecting a reward for betraying your own blood. You are walking out of here with absolutely nothing. She sat paralyzed in the chair, her chest heaving, watching the progress bar on my monitor reach 100%. The transmission was complete. The federal government now possessed the unredacted blueprint of Richard Kensington's financial crimes. Get out of my building, I ordered. Abigail stumbled out of the executive suite, her mind entirely shattered. She had betrayed her father. She had handed over his most guarded secret. She had gained absolutely nothing in return. She was going to lose everything. She was going to fall. She was going to face the very destruction she had tried to sell her father out to avoid. 20 miles away, the heavy iron gates of the Kensington family estate were suddenly violently breached. A convoy of black federal vehicles tore up the immaculate sweeping driveway, crushing the manicured landscaping beneath heavy tires. Over 40 armed IRS criminal investigation agents swarmed the property, wearing heavy tactical vests. They smashed through the massive oak front doors, their boots pounding against the imported Italian marble. Richard Kensington stood at the top of his grand staircase, looking down at the army of federal agents swarming his home. The lead agent held up a printed warrant reading off the exact account numbers from the black ledger. Richard felt the blood turn to ice in his veins. Only one person knew the combination to the secondary safe in his study. Only one person knew where he kept the physical ledger. He looked toward the open doors of his study. The safe was wide open. The black book was gone. He dropped to his knees on the carpeted landing. The realization hit him with the force of a physical blow. It was not Rebecca Montgomery who had delivered the final fatal strike. It was his own flesh and blood. His own daughter had sold him out. Richard stood completely frozen on the carpeted landing of his grand staircase, the sound of federal agents tearing through his antique mahogany desk, echoing up the stairwell. His own daughter. Abigail had taken the ledger. She had traded his freedom for a desperate, pathetic chance at her own survival. He gripped the oak banister so hard his knuckles turned white. He wanted to collapse onto the floor. He wanted to scream until his throat bled. But the heavy gold Rolex on his wrist ticked relentlessly. It was 6 o'clock in the morning. The emergency shareholder meeting was in exactly 1 hour. If he lost control of the company, the IRS raid on his home would be the absolute least of his problems. He adjusted his silk tie, forced his trembling hands to steady, and walked straight past the federal agents. He was Richard Kensington. He would spin this. He always spun this. The Grand Assembly Hall at the Kensington corporate headquarters was suffocatingly tense. Hundreds of major investors, board members, and institutional shareholders packed the velvet-lined seats. The air hummed with frantic, anxious whispers. News of Preston's dramatic arrest in a flooded alleyway had already leaked to the press. Rumors of a massive federal raid on the Kensington family estate were currently circulating on encrypted financial blogs. The investors were panicked, smelling blood in the water and demanding immediate answers. Richard stepped up to the acrylic podium, and the murmurs in the room instantly died down. He gripped the edges of the podium, tightly projecting an aura of absolute, unshakable confidence. He looked entirely exhausted, his skin gray beneath the harsh stage lights, but he lifted his chin with his trademark arrogance. "Ladies and gentlemen," Richard boomed, his voice resonating smoothly through the state-of-the-art sound system. "I know you have heard the noise today. I know the media is currently circling like vultures peddling sensationalized fiction about my family. I am here to ask you not to let their cheap theatrics blind you to the economic facts." He swept his gaze across the room, locking eyes with key investors, manipulating them just as he had done for 4 decades. "My son made a personal error in judgment, which is being handled privately by our legal team," Richard continued smoothly. "The federal inquiries at my home are nothing more than routine compliance checks, completely standard for a corporation of our massive global footprint. The truth is, Kensington Hotels has never been stronger." He lied with the breathtaking ease of a man who had completely believed his own mythology. He did not mention the catastrophic $150 million margin call that was expiring in less than 20 hours. He did not mention the violent Chicago syndicate preparing to legally seize every single brick of his empire. He certainly did not mention that his private offshore ledger was currently sitting on an IRS investigator's desk. "We have secured a massive private capital injection," Richard proclaimed, his voice rising in a crescendo of fabricated triumph. "Our liquidity is absolute. We are expanding, not retreating. I am asking the board today to authorize a defensive restructuring to permanently block any hostile takeover attempts from predatory firms like Montgomery Capital. We will protect our legacy, and we will crush anyone who tries to take it from us." The heavy mahogany doors at the back of the assembly hall swung open with a resounding violent crack. The sound cut through Richard's rising applause like a gunshot. Every single head in the massive room turned toward the entrance. I stood in the threshold. I wore a razor-sharp charcoal suit, my posture radiating absolute, unyielding authority. But I was not alone. Flanking me were 6 top-tier corporate auditors, their expressions carved from stone, each carrying thick, sealed financial dossiers. And walking directly beside me, looking pale, defeated, and flanked by 2 private security contractors, was Malcolm. The former chief financial officer of Kensington Hotels had been pulled directly from federal custody. He wore a cheap suit, and a heavy GPS monitoring ankle bracelet was clearly visible above his shoes. The room erupted into absolute chaos. Shareholders gasped, jumping from their seats and pointing at the disgraced executive. Richard's face contorted in sheer, unadulterated panic. "Security!" he bellowed into the microphone, his polished facade instantly shattering into a million pieces. "Remove them immediately. They have absolutely no authorization to be in this building. Get them out of here." The security guards at the perimeter of the room stepped forward, but my father, William Montgomery, stepped out from the shadows of the corridor behind me. He simply raised a single hand. The guards stopped dead in their tracks, recognizing the man who actually controlled the financial pulse of the city. No one was going to touch me. I walked down the center aisle, my heels clicking rhythmically against the hardwood floor. The crowd of wealthy investors parted for me, instinctively stepping back from the sheer gravity of the moment. I did not rush. I let the silence and the thick tension stretch until it was nearly unbearable. Richard gripped the podium, his chest heaving, trapped like a rat on a stage he had built for his own coronation. I reached the stage and ascended the short flight of stairs without breaking eye contact with the crumbling patriarch. I stepped right up to the podium, forcing Richard to take a humiliating, trembling step backward. I did not raise my voice. I simply reached out and took the microphone from the stand. Richard Kensington has just assured you of the company's absolute liquidity. I said, my voice carrying a lethal, icy calm through the massive, breathless hall. He has asked for your blind trust. He has asked you to ignore reality. I am here to offer you the undisputed truth. I pulled a silver flash drive from my pocket and slotted it directly into the master console on the podium. I bypassed Richard's carefully curated presentation software with a single keystroke. The massive digital screens behind the stage, which had been glowing with the proud Kensington logo, instantly flickered and changed. I projected the raw, unredacted data for all 800 shareholders to witness. The screens illuminated with the catastrophic reality of the Kensington empire. First, I displayed the brutal default notices from the Chicago syndicate, highlighting the immediate $150 million margin call in bright red ink. Next, I brought up Malcolm's signed notarized confession alongside the exact embezzlement ledgers, proving the profound internal rot. Finally, I displayed the true corporate debt sheets, revealing a massive web of toxic liabilities that proved beyond a shadow of a doubt that Kensington Hotels was entirely irreversibly bankrupt. For a fraction of a second, the assembly hall was trapped in a vacuum of absolute silence. The 800 stakeholders stared at the massive digital screens, their minds struggling to process the catastrophic financial reality glowing in harsh, unforgiving red. Then the room detonated. The grand hall erupted into a deafening roar of fury, panic, and sheer, unadulterated outrage. Men and women in expensive bespoke suits leaped from their velvet seats. They shouted obscenities, waving their tablets and stock portfolios in the air, demanding Richard Kensington explain the nightmare displayed before them. Richard frantically pounded his fist against the acrylic podium. He leaned into the microphone, his voice cracking as he desperately tried to regain control of the furious mob. "Please," he shouted over the deafening din. "Please listen to me. These are fabricated documents. This is a corporate hit job. This is a lie designed to cause a panic." "It is not a lie, Richard." My voice cut through the chaos, amplified by the same sound system, instantly freezing the room. The sheer authority in my tone acted like a bucket of ice water over the blazing assembly. I stepped directly beside him, close enough to see the beads of cold sweat tracking through the deep, panicked lines of his face. "It is not a lie. It is the autopsy of your empire." I turned my back to the broken patriarch, facing the sea of panicked investors. I raised my hand, and the murmurs died down, replaced by a tense, suffocating anticipation. They wanted answers. They demanded an explanation for the vaporization of their wealth, and I was the only person on that stage holding the keys. "For 5 years, Richard Kensington has sold you an illusion," I announced, projecting my voice clearly to the back rows of the theater. "He sold you an illusion of wealth. He sold you an illusion of stability. He sold you an illusion of legacy. But illusions do not pay federal taxes, and illusions do not satisfy $150 million margin calls. You invested in a mirage. You trusted a ghost." I gestured toward Malcolm, who stood silently at the edge of the stage, flanked by his private security escorts. "Malcolm Kensington, your former chief financial officer, understood the reality of this sinking ship long before it struck the iceberg. When the federal indictments began circling, he came to me. He surrendered his entire 15% voting stake in Kensington Hotels in exchange for legal protection from the ensuing fallout." Richard lunged forward, his face purple with rage, his manicured fingernails digging into the podium. "He is a criminal!" Richard screamed, pointing a trembling finger at his own brother. "You are taking the word of a convicted embezzler. You are listening to a traitor." "I am taking his shares," I corrected sharply, never breaking eye contact with the audience. "I am taking his shares, and I am adding them to my own portfolio." I walked back to the master console and pressed a single key. The screen shifted again, displaying a certified transfer of corporate deeds heavily stamped by federal regulators. You see, Richard believed he had outsmarted Montgomery Capital? I continued, my tone dropping to a conversational yet terrifying register. When traditional banks froze him out, he sought capital from the street. He borrowed $50 million of shadow money to keep this company afloat, blindly signing a contract that contained a predatory margin call provision. He thought he was dealing with underworld lenders. He thought he had bypassed the establishment. He was actually dealing with a subsidiary holding company fully owned and operated by Montgomery Capital. The collective gasp from the audience was audible. A ripple of sheer horror washed over the front rows. Richard staggered backward, his knees visibly buckling as the absolute magnitude of his miscalculation finally set in. He had not outrun the wolf. He had sprinted directly into its jaws. When the federal raid on the Kensington estate hit the newswires at dawn, I explained, pacing slowly across the stage, that triggered the material adverse change clause in that specific contract. The loan was instantly called. Richard could not pay the $150 million penalty. Therefore, the collateral clause was automatically executed. I stopped pacing and turned to face Richard directly. I wanted to see the exact moment his soul shattered. I wanted to witness the total destruction of the man who had treated me like disposable trash. I did not freeze your accounts to watch you squirm, Richard. I froze your accounts so you would run to the shadow lenders. I forced you into that corner. I built that trap. And you walked right into it. Through the execution of the collateral clause, Montgomery Capital has legally seized 60% of Kensington hotels. Combined with Malcolm's 15%, I now hold an undisputed 75% controlling interest in this corporation. I stepped closer to him, lowering my voice so only the microphone would catch the cold, hard finality of my words. I pressed the reality of his failure into his mind, driving the truth home with a relentless, deliberate rhythm. I own your hotels. I own your properties. I own your debt. I own your legacy. Richard's chest heaved. His eyes darted wildly around the room, searching for a friendly face, an ally, a lifeline. He found absolutely nothing but disgusted glares and turned backs. The investors who had once kissed his ring now looked at him like a diseased rat. He was a trapped animal stripped of his teeth and claws, but his ego refused to die quietly. Security! Richard roared, his voice tearing in his throat. Security! Get this woman off my stage! Get her out of my building! I am still the chief executive officer of this company. I demand you remove her right now. He pointed frantically toward the back of the hall. He pointed toward the aisles. He waited for his loyal guards to rush the stage. At the back of the hall, the massive double doors remained closed. Along the perimeter of the room, the 24 uniformed security guards did not flinch. They did not reach for their radios. They did not take a single step toward the stage. They simply stood at attention, their hands folded neatly behind their backs, staring blankly ahead. Richard slammed his hand against the podium. "Did you not hear me?" I said. "Remove her." I reached out and gently pushed his trembling hand off the acrylic surface. "They hear you perfectly, Richard," I said softly. "But they do not work for you anymore. I bought out the building's security contract at midnight. They answer exclusively to me." Richard Kensington stared at me, his jaw trembling, his eyes wide with a terror he had never known in his entire privileged existence. He was a king without a kingdom, a general without an army, a man who had spent his life destroying others, finally forced to drink his own poison. The absolute finality of his defeat washed the last traces of color from his face. I turned back to the audience, my voice echoing with absolute, unquestionable authority. As the 75% majority shareholder, I am exercising my right to convene an immediate vote of no confidence. I looked back at Richard, meeting his broken, watery eyes. Richard Kensington, effective immediately, you are terminated as Chief Executive Officer of this corporation. You are stripped of your board seat. You are stripped of your pension. You are stripped of your parking privileges. You will not return to your corner office. You will not collect your personal belongings. You will walk out of those double doors and you will vacate my premises immediately." Richard stood completely paralyzed at the base of the stage, his hands hanging uselessly at his sides. The absolute silence in the grand assembly hall was more deafening than the screaming had been. 800 shareholders stared down at him, their faces twisted in a mixture of revulsion and sheer disbelief. The titan of Manhattan real estate, the untouchable patriarch of the Kensington dynasty, had just been publicly stripped of everything he owned by the woman he had spent 5 years treating like dirt. He opened his mouth to speak, to issue a command to salvage a single scrap of his shattered dignity, but his throat was entirely dry. There was absolutely nothing left to say. He turned around slowly, his shoulders slumped beneath his expensive bespoke suit, and began the long, agonizing walk down the center aisle. The investors did not look away. They watched him drag his feet, parting like the Red Sea, to avoid brushing against the fabric of a ruined man. He was halfway to the mahogany double doors when they suddenly burst open inward, hitting the walls with a violent, resounding crash. Richard froze. It was not his private security team coming to save him. It was a phalanx of federal agents. Over a dozen men and women wearing dark windbreakers, emblazoned with the bright yellow letters of the FBI and the IRS Criminal Investigation Division, marched straight into the assembly hall. The lead agent, a tall, broad-shouldered man, with a face carved from granite, marched directly toward Richard. He did not lower his voice. He did not offer the disgraced CEO the courtesy of a private conversation. "Richard Kensington," the agent announced, his voice carrying clearly to every single investor in the room. "You are under arrest for conspiracy to commit wire fraud, massive corporate malfeasance, and over 36 counts of federal tax evasion." Richard staggered backward, shaking his head frantically. "You have no proof of this. This is a corporate setup. This is an illegal witch hunt." "We have the ledger, Richard," the agent stated flatly, pulling a pair of heavy steel handcuffs from his belt. "We have the physical black book containing your offshore accounts in the Cayman Islands. We have the digitized scans of the shell companies you used to bleed this corporation dry. We also have the fully corroborated sworn testimony of your former chief financial officer, Malcolm Kensington, who has officially turned state's evidence against you." The blood drained entirely from Richard's face. The black book, the safe in his private study. Abigail, his own daughter, the child he had coddled and financed her entire life, had handed his executioners the murder weapon. She had sold his freedom to save her own skin. "Turn around and place your hands behind your back," the agent commanded. Richard did not fight. The last ounce of fight had been bled out of him the moment I projected his bankruptcy on the main screen. He turned around, offering his wrists to the federal agent. The heavy steel ratcheted shut around his wrists with a cold metallic click that echoed sharply across the silent room. As the agent secured the restraints, Richard slowly turned his head to look back at the stage. He looked directly at me. I stood perfectly still behind the acrylic podium, my hands resting lightly on the edges, watching his destruction with absolute unblinking calm. In that fleeting second, the sheer magnitude of his failure finally crushed him. The Kensington legacy had survived World War's economic depressions and market crashes. It was a 100-year-old empire built on ruthless ambition and ironclad control. And he had single-handedly destroyed it all because of his own blinding arrogance. He had brought the Trojan horse directly into his own castle. He had looked at a quiet, polite orphan and seen a vulnerable target to be bullied and controlled. He had never bothered to wonder why I was so quiet. He had never realized he was staring into the eyes of a predator waiting patiently for the perfect moment to strike. By mistreating the orphan, he had handed the keys of his century-old dynasty directly to the Montgomery family. "Let us go," the agent ordered, gripping Richard by the bicep. The federal agents marched the broken patriarch out of the assembly hall. They did not take him through the private executive elevators. They marched him directly toward the main public lobby. Richard kept his head down, staring at the imported Italian marble floors he had personally selected for the building. His wrists throbbed against the cold steel of the handcuffs. He was a dead man marching toward a federal holding cell he would likely never leave. Down in the soaring glass atrium of the main lobby, the morning sun was just beginning to break through the rain clouds. The massive revolving doors slid open, and a figure stumbled inside, shivering and completely disheveled. It was Preston. The Kensington heir had just spent the most terrifying night of his life in a maximum security holding cell. He had wept. He had begged. He had traded every single piece of useful information he possessed to a ruthless federal prosecutor just to secure a temporary, highly restricted plea deal release. He was wearing the same damp, wrinkled clothes from the alleyway. His shattered wrist was hastily immobilized in a cheap hospital splint. He had rushed straight to the corporate headquarters, desperately seeking the safety of his father's office. He needed Richard to fix this. He needed Richard to unleash the army of corporate lawyers and make the nightmare disappear. Preston limped toward the private executive elevators, his breath hitching with relief as he saw the gold-plated doors begin to open. Daddy was going to fix it. Daddy always fixed it. The elevator doors parted. Preston froze in his tracks, his jaw dropping open in sheer, unadulterated horror. Stepping out of the elevator was his father. Richard Kensington, the untouchable titan of Manhattan, was flanked by 4 armed federal agents. His hands were chained behind his back. His suit was rumpled. His eyes were completely hollow. Father Preston choked out his voice, cracking into a pathetic, high-pitched whine. Richard slowly lifted his head. He looked at his ruined, pathetic son standing in the lobby of the building they no longer owned. Richard did not offer a word of comfort. He did not promise that his lawyers would sort this out. He simply looked away, dropping his gaze back to the marble floor as the FBI agents marched him straight past his son and out into the harsh morning light. For a fraction of a second, the assembly hall was trapped in a vacuum of absolute silence. The 800 stakeholders stared at the massive digital screens, their minds struggling to process the catastrophic financial reality glowing in harsh, unforgiving red. Then the room detonated. The grand hall erupted into a deafening roar of fury, panic, and sheer, unadulterated outrage. Men and women in expensive bespoke suits leaped from their velvet seats. They shouted obscenities, waving their tablets and stock portfolios in the air, demanding Richard Kensington explain the nightmare displayed before them. Several prominent board members began aggressively interrogating Malcolm from the floor, shouting over the relentless clamor of the crowd. Security personnel stationed at the exits shifted nervously, unsure of how to contain a riot consisting of the city's most elite billionaires. The sheer velocity of the collapse was unprecedented. In a matter of minutes, the supposedly invincible Kensington fortress had been reduced to smoldering ash on a digital screen. Richard frantically pounded his fist against the acrylic podium. He leaned into the microphone, his voice cracking as he desperately tried to regain control of the furious mob. "Please," he shouted over the deafening din, "please listen to me. These are fabricated documents. This is a corporate hit job. This is a lie designed to cause a panic." "It is not a lie, Richard." My voice cut through the chaos, amplified by the same sound system, instantly freezing the room. The sheer authority in my tone acted like a bucket of ice water over the blazing assembly. I stepped directly beside him, close enough to see the beads of cold sweat tracking through the deep, panicked lines of his face. "It is not a lie. It is the autopsy of your empire." I turned my back to the broken patriarch, facing the sea of panicked investors. I raised my hand, and the murmurs died down, replaced by a tense, suffocating anticipation. They wanted answers. They demanded an explanation for the vaporization of their wealth, and I was the only person on that stage holding the keys. "For 5 years, Richard Kensington has sold you an illusion," I announced, projecting my voice clearly to the back rows of the theater. "He sold you an illusion of wealth. He sold you an illusion of stability. He sold you an illusion of legacy. But illusions do not pay federal taxes, and illusions do not satisfy $150 million margin calls. You invested in a mirage. You trusted a ghost." I gestured toward Malcolm, who stood silently at the edge of the stage, flanked by his private security escorts. "Malcolm Kensington, your former chief financial officer, understood the reality of this sinking ship long before it struck the iceberg. When the federal indictments began circling, he came to me. He surrendered his entire 15% voting stake in Kensington Hotels in exchange for legal protection from the ensuing fallout. Richard lunged forward, his face purple with rage, his manicured fingernails digging into the podium. "He is a criminal!" Richard screamed, pointing a trembling finger at his own brother. "You are taking the word of a convicted embezzler. You are listening to a traitor." "I am taking his shares," I corrected sharply, never breaking eye contact with the audience. "I am taking his shares and I am adding them to my own portfolio." You see, the Kensington Empire was built on a foundation of leverage, a house of cards that only stood as long as the wind blew in Richard's favor. The moment the wind shifted, the entire structure collapsed. I walked back to the master console and pressed a single key. The screens shifted again, displaying a certified transfer of corporate deeds heavily stamped by federal regulators. Kensington Hotels equity transfer, acquiring entity Montgomery Capital. Acquired assets, 60% default seizure, plus 15%, voluntary surrender. Total controlling interest, 75%. Richard believed he had outsmarted Montgomery Capital. I continued, my tone dropping to a conversational yet terrifying register. When traditional banks froze him out, he sought capital from the street. He borrowed $50 million of shadow money to keep this company afloat, blindly signing a contract that contained a predatory margin call provision. He thought he was dealing with underworld lenders. He thought he had bypassed the establishment. He was actually dealing with a subsidiary holding company fully owned and operated by Montgomery Capital. The collective gasp from the audience was audible. A ripple of sheer horror washed over the front rows. Richard staggered backward, his knees visibly buckling as the absolute magnitude of his miscalculation finally set in. He had not outrun the wolf. He had sprinted directly into its jaws. When the federal raid on the Kensington estate hit the newswires at dawn, I explained, pacing slowly across the stage, that triggered the material adverse change clause in that specific contract. The loan was instantly called. Richard could not pay the $150 million penalty. Therefore, the collateral clause was automatically executed. I stopped pacing and turned to face Richard directly. I wanted to see the exact moment his soul shattered. I wanted to witness the total destruction of the man who had treated me like disposable trash. "I did not freeze your accounts to watch you squirm, Richard. I froze your accounts so you would run to the shadow lenders. I forced you into that corner. I built that trap. And you walked right into it. Through the execution of the collateral clause, Montgomery Capital has legally seized 60% of Kensington Hotels. Combined with Malcolm's 15%, I now hold an undisputed 75% controlling interest in this corporation." I stepped closer to him, lowering my voice so only the microphone would catch the cold, hard finality of my words. I pressed the reality of his failure into his mind, driving the truth home with a relentless, deliberate rhythm. "I own your hotels. I own your properties. I own your debt. I own your legacy." Richard's chest heaved. His eyes darted wildly around the room, searching for a friendly face, an ally, a lifeline. He found absolutely nothing but disgusted glares and turned backs. Men who had toasted to his health mere days ago were now frantically dialing their personal attorneys, desperately trying to untangle their own assets from his sinking ship. The investors who had once kissed his ring now looked at him like a diseased rat. He was a trapped animal, stripped of his teeth and claws, but his ego refused to die quietly. "Security!" Richard roared, his voice tearing in his throat. "Security! Get this woman off my stage. Get her out of my building. I am still the chief executive officer of this company. I demand you remove her right now." He pointed frantically toward the back of the hall. He pointed toward the aisles. He waited for his loyal guards to rush the stage. At the back of the hall, the massive double doors remained closed. Along the perimeter of the room, the 24 uniformed security guards did not flinch. They did not reach for their radios. They did not take a single step toward the stage. They simply stood at attention, their hands folded neatly behind their backs, staring blankly ahead. Richard slammed his hand against the podium. "Did you not hear me? I said remove her." I reached out and gently pushed his trembling hand off the acrylic surface. "They hear you perfectly, Richard," I said softly. "But they do not work for you anymore. I bought out the building's security contract at midnight. They answer exclusively to me. Richard Kensington stared at me, his jaw trembling, his eyes wide with a terror he had never known in his entire privileged existence. He was a king without a kingdom, a general without an army, a man who had spent his life destroying others, finally forced to drink his own poison. The absolute finality of his defeat washed the last traces of color from his face. I turned back to the audience, my voice echoing with absolute unquestionable authority. As the 75% majority shareholder, I am exercising my right to convene an immediate vote of no confidence. I looked back at Richard, meeting his broken, watery eyes. Richard Kensington, effective immediately, you are terminated as Chief Executive Officer of this corporation. You are stripped of your board seat. You are stripped of your pension. You are stripped of your parking privileges. You will not return to your corner office. You will not collect your personal belongings. You will surrender your corporate access keys to my security team on your way out. You will walk out of those double doors, and you will vacate my premises immediately. Preston watched the revolving doors spin to a halt, his father's figure disappearing into the back of a black Federal SUV. The flashing red and blue lights painted Preston's pale face in alternating strokes of panic and despair. He stood shivering in the grand lobby, clutching his splinted wrist, entirely unable to comprehend the sudden evaporation of his universe. Then the familiar sharp chime of the executive elevator echoed through the cavernous space. I stepped out into the lobby. My charcoal suit was immaculate, my posture radiating absolute control. Flanking me were two of my top corporate litigators and four members of the building's new security detail. I looked at the man who had once been my husband. He was a pathetic, ruined shadow of the arrogant heir who had paraded his mistress through my home. Rebecca Preston choked out his voice, cracking violently as he stumbled toward me. My security detail immediately stepped forward, forming a physical wall between us, but I raised a single hand. They parted just enough to let him stand a few feet away. He looked absolutely wretched, reeking of damp alleyways and cheap jailhouse soap. "Rebecca, you have to help me," he begged, tears streaming down his bruised face. "They took everything. My black cards are declining. The biometric scanners locked me out of the penthouse. They even seized my cars. I have absolutely nowhere to go. You have to stop this." I stared at him, my expression carved from ice. "I have absolutely no intention of stopping anything, Preston." He fell to his knees right there on the imported Italian marble, uncaring of the lobby staff and security guards watching his total humiliation. He reached out desperately, trying to grasp the hem of my trousers, but my security chief kicked his hand away. "Please," Preston sobbed, looking up at me with wide, bloodshot eyes. "Remember our vows. Remember the good times. Before my father got in my head before the anniversary gala, we were happy. I was manipulated, Rebecca. My father brainwashed me. He forced me to hide the money. He forced me to engage in the fraud. I never wanted to hurt you. You are the only woman I have ever truly loved. I know you still care about me. We can fix this. We can start over." I let his pathetic, sniveling apologies echo through the vast lobby. I let the silence stretch until his sobbing reduced to pathetic, ragged gasps. Then I unclasped a thick, sealed manila envelope from my assistant's hand and dropped it directly onto the marble floor in front of his knees. "Pick it up," I commanded softly. Preston grabbed the envelope with his good hand, his fingers trembling violently as he tore it open. He pulled out a stack of heavily redacted bank statements and court orders. His eyes darted frantically across the bold black text. "That is a comprehensive breakdown of your current financial standing," I explained, my voice echoing coldly across the lobby. "As you are aware, your blatant public infidelity triggered the penalty clause in our prenuptial agreement. You owe me exactly $100 million. And because of the federal raid on your father's illicit shell companies, your hidden assets are no longer hidden. Montgomery Capital has legally garnished every single one of your personal bank accounts, your trust funds, and your offshore portfolios. The balance has been seized. You possess absolutely nothing, Lee." Preston stared at the documents, his chest heaving as the catastrophic reality finally penetrated his thick skull. "But my accounts only held 20 million, he stammered, looking up at me in sheer terror. "Correct. I replied smoothly. Which means you are currently $80 million in debt to me. You are completely bankrupt. You have no family backing, no corporate protection, and no home. He dropped the papers, burying his face in his hands. How am I supposed to survive? He wailed, his voice echoing pathetically against the glass walls. I have no money for food. I have no money for a hotel. I have never worked a real job in my entire life. What do you expect me to do? I smiled. It was a razor-sharp, lethal expression. I reached out and took a folded square of heavy industrial fabric from my security chief. I stepped forward and held it out to him. I expect you to pay off your debt, I said. Preston looked up, his tear-streaked face contorting in confusion. He slowly reached out and took the fabric. He stood up, his knees shaking, and let the material unfold in his hands. It was a heavy gray cotton jumpsuit, a standard-issue janitorial uniform. Embroidered in bright silver thread on the left breast pocket was the Kensington Hotel's logo. Directly beneath the logo, stitched in bold block letters, was the word maintenance. You owe me $100 million, I stated, my voice ringing with absolute unyielding authority. At minimum wage, scrubbing the toilets in the hotel you used to own it will take you a few lifetimes. You start on the night shift. Preston stared at the gray jumpsuit, his eyes wide with visceral, unadulterated horror. The sheer indignity of the proposition hit him like a physical blow. The entitled heir, the man who had spent his entire life ordering people around and treating the working class like invisible dirt, was being told to pick up a mop. No! Preston spat, his face suddenly flushing with indignant rage. He threw the uniform violently onto the marble floor. I will never wear that. I am a Kensington. I am a senior executive. I will absolutely not scrub toilets for you or anyone else. I will leave the country. I will disappear. You cannot force me to be a janitor. I did not raise my voice. I did not flinch. I simply stepped closer to him, closing the distance until I could see the frantic pulse beating in his neck. You seem to have forgotten the specific stipulations of your temporary release, Preston. I said, my tone lethally calm. You signed a federal plea deal this morning to avoid being locked in a cell next to your father. That agreement requires your strict absolute adherence to all civil restitution judgments. If you miss a single shift, if you violate the repayment terms by a single cent, or if you attempt to leave this city, I make one phone call to the prosecutor. I let the threat hang in the air, heavy and inescapable. Your plea deal will be instantly revoked. I continued, enunciating every single word. You will not get a trial. You will be sent directly to a maximum security federal penitentiary for corporate fraud, insider trading, and perjury. You will spend the next 20 years sharing a concrete box with your father. Preston's mouth opened, but no sound came out. The defiant rage evaporated from his eyes, instantly replaced by the crushing, suffocating realization that he was entirely trapped. He had no leverage. He had no escape. The invisible walls of his new prison slammed shut around him. I had systematically dismantled his wealth, his family, his pride, and his future. He was entirely at my mercy. Pick it up, I whispered. Preston stared at me, his chest trembling with defeated, ragged breaths. He looked at the armed security guards surrounding us. He looked at the heavy glass doors of the lobby, leading out into a world where he had absolutely nothing. Slowly, agonizingly, the last remnants of the Kensington arrogance drained out of him. He bent down. His good hand reached out, his fingers brushing against the cold marble floor. He picked up the gray janitorial uniform, clutching it tightly to his chest. He did not look at me again. Utterly crushed and completely broken, Preston turned around and began the long, humiliating walk down the service corridor, heading straight toward the employee locker rooms. Exactly 30 days later, the Kensington name was nothing more than a ghost haunting the polished marble corridors of Montgomery Plaza. The rebranding was swift, the restructuring was ruthless, the rebirth was absolute. The toxic culture that had choked the life out of the employees under Richard's reign had been surgically excised from the corporate bloodstream. I had personally fired every single executive complicit in the embezzlement scheme. I had personally ripped out the archaic hierarchy that rewarded sycophants and punished hard work. I had personally reviewed every staff contract raising wages and implementing the Montgomery standard of excellence across the board. Gone was the culture of fear. Gone was the suffocating dread. Gone was the era of the Kensingtons. The hotel was now a beacon of modern luxury, running at peak operational efficiency, generating higher profit margins in 4 weeks than Richard had managed in 4 years. I walked into the grand ballroom to inspect the preparations for the evening's global summit. I wore a bespoke charcoal suit cut from Italian wool, my heels clicking a steady, commanding rhythm against the gleaming hardwood floor. The sound echoed off the vaulted ceilings, a sharp reminder of exactly who controlled this space. This was the exact room where Richard had once struck me. This was the exact spot where he had tried to break my spirit. This was the exact center of his former power. The memory of his hand cracking against my cheek used to burn. It used to sting. It used to keep me awake. Now the memory was completely powerless. As I walked across the vast expanse of the ballroom, every single event coordinator, every catering manager, and every lighting technician stopped their work. They turned. They offered respectful nods. They did not bow out of fear of arbitrary retaliation. They bowed out of genuine respect for the woman who had saved their livelihoods. My father, William Montgomery, walked in step beside me. His silver hair caught the light of the refurbished crystal chandeliers. He looked at the towering floral arrangements, the impeccable table settings, the sheer scale of the operation I had seamlessly taken over. He did not need to offer a long emotional speech. He did not need to shower me with loud praise. The quiet pride radiating from his posture was a louder validation than any words could ever provide. We had taken the Kensington crown jewel. We had stripped away the rot. We had polished it until it blinded everyone who had ever doubted our family. We exited the ballroom, moving down the long, gilded corridor toward the private executive exit. The hallway was lined with fresh orchids, the air smelling of expensive vanilla and clean linen. As we approached the service alcove housing the staff restrooms and supply closets, a heavy oak door was propped open. A harsh, stinging smell of industrial bleach spilled into the pristine hallway, momentarily cutting through the vanilla. A man stepped out of the supply closet holding a dripping gray mop. He wore the heavy gray cotton jumpsuit. The bright silver thread of the maintenance logo caught the overhead light, a glaring badge of his new reality. It was Preston. His skin, once pampered by weekly spa treatments and expensive yachting trips, was sallow and broken out. His shoulders, once held high with unearned arrogance, were permanently hunched beneath the weight of physical labor. His hands, which had never known a hard day's work in 30 years, were red-cracked and blistered from harsh chemical cleaners. His eyes were entirely hollow. The manicured, entitled Prince of Manhattan had been ground down to a tired, invisible laborer trapped in a prison of his own making. He stopped walking. He froze in the center of the corridor. He stared directly at me, his knuckles turned white around the wooden handle of the mop. He waited for me to react. He waited for the gloating. He waited for the cruel smirk. He waited for the cutting remark that would validate his existence. For a narcissist, any attention is oxygen. Any reaction is proof that they still matter. He wanted my anger. He wanted my pity. He wanted my scorn. If I lashed out, he would still be a central figure in my narrative. If I mocked him, he would still hold emotional real estate in my mind. I did not slow my pace. I did not turn my head. I did not acknowledge the mop, the jumpsuit, or the broken man wearing it. I looked straight through him as if he were a smudge on the wallpaper. I walked past him. I breathed the air past him. I moved forward without a single microscopic flicker of recognition. To me, he was not Preston Kensington. He was not my former husband. He was not a conquered enemy. He was simply a janitor holding a mop in a hallway that I owned. I did not care about his pain. I did not care about his exhaustion. I did not care about his existence. Out of the corner of my eye, I could see the exact moment his spirit finally snapped completely. My total indifference was the one weapon he could not fight against. Being hated meant he was significant. Being ignored meant he was absolutely nothing. He was erased. I pushed through the heavy glass doors of the lobby. The bright, blinding New York sunshine washed over my face, carrying the crisp electric promise of a new morning. The city roared to life around me, a symphony of ambition and power. A black armored town car idled at the curb, its engine purring softly, the driver holding the rear door open for me. I stepped out into the brilliant light, leaving the shadows, the bleach, and the ashes of the Kensington Empire permanently behind me. I slid into the luxurious leather seat. I looked out the tinted window at the towering, endless skyline waiting to be conquered. The revenge was complete. The revenge was precise. The revenge was absolute. The ultimate lesson from this story is that true power does not come from lowering yourself to the level of your abusers. For years, Rebecca endured humiliation, manipulation, and betrayal. However, she did not seek vengeance through emotional outbursts. Instead, she quietly secured her independence and allowed their blinding arrogance to orchestrate their own downfall. The absolute sweetest revenge is never found in screaming matches. It is found in untouchable self-made success. When you reclaim your self-worth and build your own empire, toxic people lose their control entirely. Ultimately, treating a narcissist with total chilling indifference remains their greatest punishment.